The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Well, he'll make something up. And he'll just intervene on the law. Order, order. I must advise members that under the terms of the House's long-standing resolution on matters sub judice, they must not refer to specific cases that are currently subject to legal proceedings. That includes coroners' courts. Members may, of course, speak to the general issue. Damien Moore to open the motion.
Thank you, Mrs Mooney. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 243947 relating to immunity for soldiers. Allow me to also extend my gratitude to Karen Webb-James for starting this petition, which attracted in excess of 146,000 signatures, including 238 from my own constituency, and calls on the government to not prosecute the military for its work in Northern Ireland and to prevent criminal investigations after a certain period of time. I am pleased to address, in the time I have, the topic and sentiment of this petition. Through reports such as the 2017 investigations into fatalities in Northern Ireland involving British military personnel by the Defence Committee and written evidence put forth by that committee by such individuals as Professor Richard Eakins, we have learned more about this issue and its extensiveness and found out that the historical prosecution of our armed forces personnel could easily refer to other more modern theatres of conflict. I know that other right honourable and honourable members will wish to refer to those instances, and I pay tribute to all of those who have served in operations, especially to those who have died in the service of our country. Given the nature of this petition we are about to discuss, though, I hope members will understand if I concentrate my remarks, mainly and with good reason, on the situation in Northern Ireland. In recent days, the government has sought, on the subject of immunity, albeit unintentionally, to draw a distinction between those who served in Northern Ireland and in other theatres, and I hope to address this lack of parity in my later remarks. On the subject of the petition, the government responded on the 1st of April, stating, "This government is unequivocal in our admiration for the armed forces whose sacrifices ensured terrorism would never succeed. However, our approach to the past must be consistent with the rule of law." They went on, "This government will always salute the heroism and bravery of the soldiers and police officers who serve to protect the people of Northern Ireland and in too many cases paid the ultimate price. It is only due to the courageous efforts of our security forces that we have relative peace and stability in Northern Ireland today. Our security forces ensure that Northern Ireland's future will only be ever decided by democracy and consent, and never by violence. Over 250,000 people served in Northern Ireland during Operation Banner, the longest continuous military development in our country's history. the vast majority with courage, professionalism and great distinction, this government will never forget the debt of gratitude we owe them. And yet, despite the government's unwavering gratitude to our armed forces, there remains a disproportionately high and arguably unnecessarily number of investigations when compared with the level of killings attributed to the armed forces in Northern Ireland. As the Honourable Member for Lagan Valley pointed out in his speech to the House of Commons in 2017, the reality today is that 90% of the resources of the Legacy Investigation Branch are devoted to investigating 10% of the deaths during the Troubles, and 10% of its resources are devoted to investigating 90% of deaths. It is this very issue that this petition seeks to address. I'll allow the Honourable Member to give way.
I'm very grateful. He's hit on a key point here. Members of the armed forces and the security forces went out every day during Op Banner to prevent people from being killed and had to make extraordinary decisions at a moment's notice affecting life and death. The terrorists went out to kill and maim. That was their purpose. And we have to remember that 90% of the deaths in Northern Ireland over the course of the Troubles was at the hand of terrorists.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Those in the armed forces from the outset were there to protect peace, and those terrorists were there to actually inflict harm on people, and that is an important distinction that we have to make. So allow me to say from the outset that I hold veterans and serving members of our armed forces in the highest regard, and that I hope and believe that is shared sentiment across this chamber. In my so far short tenure as the Member of Parliament for Southport, I have always sought to spend a considerable amount of my time and in Parliament raising issues to those who have served and continue to serve in our armed forces. And I am glad so to do again today. Although I think many members would agree that this issue should have been resolved some time ago. I welcome the opportunity for this debate and thank all members present, including right honourable friends from the breadth of Parliament, and I am delighted to see my honourable friend, the member for Plymouth Moor View, whose perseverance and unrelenting dedication to our veterans has no doubt encouraged the government to act more swiftly on this issue before us. Whilst policing and justice issues in Northern Ireland are now ordinarily devolved to the Northern Ireland Executive or the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland in its absence, the legacy of the Troubles is one that remains a matter for this Parliament and the UK Government to contend with. I believe that it is being met with the utmost respect and candour is the only thing we can do to do justice to it. In a previous debate on this very topic held in this House in May last year, my honourable friend Sir Henry Bellingham, the member for North West Norfolk, reminded us of the incredibly high numbers of lives lost during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. We know that 3,500 people were killed in those terrible years, but let us break this figure down. Out of the astonishing 3,500 victims, approximately 3,000 were killed by non-state forces, Republican terrorist and loyalist paramilitaries. 370 were killed by security forces. A total of 722 members of the security services, mainly British soldiers, were also killed. That is, twice as many soldiers were killed by terrorists as terrorists were killed by soldiers. This very fact should give us, as British citizens, tremendous confidence in our armed forces. It is proof of the commendable restraint shown by the British Army and indeed the police service for Northern Ireland at that time. All those killings, bar a few outstanding terrorist cases, have been fully investigated, but some of those often repeatedly. My honourable friend, the member for Beckenham, a distinguished and gallant veteran himself, said only last week during an urgent question on the matter that he had been through the process more than once and he is not alone. Despite the investigations, matters are complicated still further by subsequent developments, poor record keeping, the passing of former service men and women, the hundreds of royal pardons that have been granted over time, and the 500 prisoners released on licence until the year 2000. It would appear that, so far, the entire process has been rigged against our armed forces and in favour of terrorist groups. That is not closure, nor is it justice. Terrorists and illegal paramilitary forces cannot and must not be viewed or treated equally to the police and armed forces as if they were somehow standing on a shared moral ground. They never have and they never will. Yet the current legal framework would have us believe that the words terrorist and servicemen and women in the context of Northern Ireland should be treated equally. They should not. With that said, I appreciate the need for closure felt by everyone involved in those tragic years of our nation's history. Likewise, I respect the implications of the Good Friday Agreement and understand the pain and suffering endured by the victims' families who are yearning for justice. In those cases where crimes have been committed, and they do happen, albeit rarely, the rule of law, of course, should be applied. Those involved investigated and prosecutions forthcoming. But let us be clear, those instances in the midst of conflict are the exception, not the general rule. The overwhelming majority of our servicemen and women believe in the preservation of life and the rule of law. It is those very values they swore to uphold when they made their vow to the Queen and people of the United Kingdom when enlisting in our armed forces, and it is those values they believe in today. Let us look at some key historic facts. I remind honourable members that Operation Banner was the longest military engagement in the history of the British Army. During the Troubles, as I mentioned before, there were 3,500 deaths, some 60% of which were murders carried out by Republican paramilitary terrorists, mainly from the Provisional IRA. Approximately 30% were carried out by loyalist paramilitaries. British and Irish state forces responsible for 10% of deaths, almost all of which occurred entirely of lawful actions or yellow cards when soldiers and police officers were instructed to act to preserve life and uphold the virtues of the rule of law. Here's another stark fact about the period. A member of the security forces in Northern Ireland was 3 times more likely to be killed than a member of the IRA. Contrast that with today's theatres of war, where terrorist members are 3 times more likely to be killed than members of the armed forces. It is this point alone that depicts the unrelenting bravery of those who served in Northern Ireland. Let there be no doubt, paramilitary terrorists were responsible for almost 90% of deaths in Northern Ireland, including more than 3,000 unsolved murders. Consider this in comparison with the 10% of deaths that have been attributed to those who were serving in the armed forces at that time, and we may begin to understand the relentlessness faced by those victims and their beloved families, and the burning injustice faced by our veterans who are being routinely investigated. Held as a triumph in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement did advance long-term peace in Northern Ireland. To some, however, it may have been inadvertently equalised those who sought to defend the Crown and those who sought to bring it down in the most violent fashion, tilting the scale in favour of the terrorists by authorising the early release from jail of many, too many of them. Terrorists killed over 1,000 servants of the Crown involved in Operation Banner. Victims were members of several armed forces divisions, such as the Army, the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, the Ulster Defence Regiment, and the Royal Irish Regiment. Police forces, including the Royal Ulster Constabulary and other constabularies, also lost hundreds of lives at the hands of the terrorists. There is nothing any of us may do to bring those men and women back to their families and loved ones. However, there is something we can do, and we should honour them to ensure that justice be made. Instead, what the UK government did at the time, they went on to explicitly lengths to show mercy towards people who had been found guilty of the most heinous crimes. Among the many cases I could bring up as examples of this would be Sean Kelly, the infamous Shankill bomber. Prior to 1998, Kelly had been found guilty of murdering 7 people and condemned to 9 life terms in prison, but as it turned out, barely served 7 years. Despite efforts to investigate the unsolved murders occurred during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Historical Inquiries team, set up by the Chief Constable being the most prominent one, it is saddening and frustrating at the same time to see how little real effort has been put into persecuting the perpetrators of approximately 90% of the crimes committed. On the other hand, those who fought to preserve the state have been subject to multiple investigations. Some of those investigations started over 4 decades ago and have continued to be opened and closed multiple times, despite old age and with no consideration of the welfare of who they are investigating. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Congratulations on the powerful case he's making for Op Banner in particular, but will you agree with me that central to this debate today must be the fact that the Secretary of State for Defence is bringing forward an oral statement, as I understand it, tomorrow in the House of Commons, bringing in a 10-year statute of limitations on all operations around the world, apart from Northern Ireland. And can we deduce from the fact that it is the Parliament Secretary for the Northern Ireland Department who is answering this debate, the reason why Northern Ireland is excluded from tomorrow's statement is because the Northern Ireland Department insisted on it. Would it not be better if we had the Minister of Defence here answering on behalf of our soldiers?
I agree with my honourable friend. I think that's absolutely right. We should be in a case where the Ministry of Defence is taking the lead on this to defend our armed forces as they so gallantly defend us. If only the government put the same tenacity into pursuing real criminals, it would go a long way in reassuring loyal servants of the Crown, both former and current, and their family members that their service has not been, and indeed will not be, forgotten. The state asked an awful lot of these men and women at the most crucial and bloody time when its very existence was in jeopardy. They were willing and ready to answer that call. As representatives of the state ourselves, we should do everything within our power so that they do not live the last years of their lives in fear of repercussion for protecting our citizens and our values and our United Kingdom. Last week, the Secretary of State of Defence announced that British troops and veterans will be given stronger legal protections against prosecution, preventing investigations over actions on the battlefield after 10 years, except in exceptional circumstances, a move that would be repeated or unfair investigations. While I welcomed her announcement, as my honourable friend has just alluded to, I was disappointed to find that the prosecutions would exclude those involved in Operation Banner. I would give way to my...
Again, the important thing, I think, is the Secretary of Defence is bringing forward a bill to bring in this 10-year statute of limitations. A bill, of course, is amendable, and the Speaker of the House of Commons last week, in answer to a point of order from me, made it plain that this bill could be amended to include Northern Ireland. Would my honourable friend therefore agree with me and join with me in seeking to bring forward amendments to that bill so that the up-banner soldiers are included with everybody else?
Thank you. My honourable friend raises an absolutely important point, and I think it is absolutely the right thing for us to do. And I look around this room today and I see many that would join that clarion call to amend that legislation to include Operation Banner in Northern Ireland. It should not be part of an amendment, it should be in the bill already. It is this government's duty to care and look after our precious veterans who stood on the front lines to protect us from some of the bloodiest enemies our nation has ever encountered. I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank my honourable friend, and he's making an excellent speech on this issue. I think the matter at hand here is veterans who we all have, who are in their 70s, having received paperwork from the MOD, who are too scared to open it because they're worried about what it means and they don't know what happens afterwards. And so it's about people who put their lives on the line, as he said, but now don't feel they've got the support from their government or from their community about what happens next, and the government need to act.
The Honourable Lady makes an absolutely important point. A true caring environment which we should be fostering for our veterans is important, because they should not be hounded into old age and sometimes illness thinking there could be a letter or a knock at the door which they might have to answer to something that happened many, many years ago. However, to the government, there should be enough with the hesitation, enough with the special provisions that in the names of supposed human rights violations have caused our country to be derelict in that sacred duty of care. We cannot let former brave personnel spend the rest of their lives in fear of yet more investigations, more trials, more prosecutions. And it was rightly proposed by my honourable friend, the member for Aldershot, Leo Doherty, that a statute of limitations should be introduced, and I'm pleased the government are looking at that now, to shield soldiers and police officers from further scrutiny once their names have been finally cleared by our justice system. This is what the motion has previously brought to the House wants to achieve. This is what hundreds of thousands of people who signed the petition want us to do. Servants of the Crown involved in Operation Banner have had to endure far too much because of the hesitation shown by governments from 1998 until today. Whether it be in the name of political correctness or out of fear of opening old wounds, it is now our duty to put an end to any wavering and decisively take proactive action on behalf of those who so bravely put their own lives on the line out of a sense of duty and a love of country. Indeed, it falls on us as members of Parliament, and indeed to the government, to protect those who have given their lives to protect us.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 243947 relating to immunity for soldiers. Luke Pollard.
It's a pleasure to be called so early in this debate. I'll take your guidance on not speaking to the individual circumstances. My purpose of being here today is to give a voice to many of the veterans in Plymouth that have attended my surgeries and have stopped me in the street to raise their concerns about what is happening here. Because there is a real sense of betrayal amongst so many veterans for their time of what is going on with veterans in Northern Ireland. Not just, it must be said, for those people who actually served in Northern Ireland, but for those people who wore a uniform anywhere that feels that an attack on one has become an attack on all. And they have asked me to speak in this debate to pass on the very genuine and real concerns of those veterans. And in particular, they feel that the words that have been spoken by the Prime Minister and by government ministers to date have been hollow. They have not been meant. And the sense that when veterans are needed for electoral purposes, there's lots of warm words about supporting veterans, but actually when it comes to the time when many people who have served our country need support from their government, need guidance and that wraparound support from those people who sent them into conflict, into harm's way in the first place, that support and guidance is absent. So I'd be grateful if the Minister could set out in his responses to a number of the questions that I've been asked. The first one is about what new evidence means. So specifically, a number of the reasons why has been given around this area of going after veterans is because of new evidence. But the definition of what new evidence means is something that a lot of the veterans who have spoken to me struggle to understand, especially when new evidence from the past doesn't look that new or that evidential. What does it mean now? And that is a matter that doesn't prejudge any guilt or otherwise of any individuals, but just to understand the legal framework where any decisions may be taken. What support is the government, be it the Ministry of Defence or any other part of the government, providing to veterans to enable them to gain support? As was said by my old friend for Stoke-on-Trent, a number of the veterans that have contacted me are actually very old. And actually, in any other circumstance, we would be providing support for them because of their vulnerability. But actually, their strength and stoicism in terms of this is something that can't be given as a granted because of the age of many of the veterans involved and the severity of what is taking place here. Now, I haven't met any one of those veterans who has said that anyone who breaks the law should not be prosecuted. And indeed, it is something that every single one of those veterans has reinforced to me time and time again, that the UK Armed Forces are the very best in the world because they uphold the law, because they are trained in terms of what is right and wrong, and because they understand what is a legal order and what is an illegal order. And actually, that sense of training and duty that has come with them is so very important. So I'd like to ask the Minister as well, why is the decisions on this not going up the chain of command? Because actually, one question that has been raised by veterans is those people that are being looked at now in the round are part of a command structure. So if we are to look at this, at what point does the command structure come into place, those senior officers and those politicians that may or may not have given orders or set an engagement framework in which anyone serving in Northern Ireland will have operated? Happy to.
Thank you, Mrs Moon. I intervene simply because actually the command structure doesn't really come into it. The decision is in the yellow card. You have to make your own decision as to open fire. It is not, you do not have time to turn around and ask for permission. And that decision can sometimes be made very quickly. So I take the Honourable Gentleman's point about the command structure being involved, but actually with regard to opening fire, that is a personal decision, and that person who makes that decision has to stand by it and justify it. That is why it's so important to train very hard on the yellow card.
Luke Pollard.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I know from his own service to the country and his experience in Northern Ireland that he will know this better than many others in this place. It is a question that's been raised by veterans with me, in the fact that there is a sense sometimes that it's not everyone that's involved with the entire operation that are being pursued in this respect, and how are decisions made in terms of doing that. But I entirely agree with and understand the point the Honourable Member has raised. I think the sense that I have been asked to communicate, and I do so for the final time now, is a sense that there are many veterans who served Northern Ireland and who did not, who feel betrayed and let down by government. And they hope that whatever comes out of this situation and the debates that have been formed, we can be giving way.
Yeah.
Ruth Smith.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I think the matter on, I think this all comes down to the sense of fairness. A fairness both for the victims, for their families, and for everyone that lived through the Troubles in Northern Ireland and continues to live with the consequences of it, but also fairness for the veterans and for their families, so they know exactly where they stand and why. I mean, this comes back to whether we need more effort put in peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland in terms of talking, but ensuring that there isn't prosecution at the same time. So on this issue, it is down to fairness for the families, for everybody.
I thank my friend for that intervention, and I agree with her in the sense of fairness is an important part of a solution to how you deal with a sense of betrayal. It needs to, justice needs not only to be done, but to be seen to be done. And at the moment, there is pain in lots of different communities, and everyone in this House welcomes and values the progress that has been made in Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement. I would like more members to read the Good Friday Agreement because I sense there's an awful lot of debate sometimes that takes place without actually the words of that agreement having been read. However, I think there is an important part here that actually I think there's an opportunity for the ministers, be that from the Northern Ireland Office or, and especially from the Ministry of Defence, to really understand the concerns of those people that served in Northern Ireland, and equally those people who didn't, who just feel that there's something not right here. And I'd be grateful if the Minister could address the concerns, especially about the definition of new evidence when it comes to his concluding remarks. Thank you.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. I served over 3 years in Northern Ireland, 7 operational tours. I first went to Northern Ireland in 1970. Sadly, I lost 6 men directly under my command, many more in my unit. Almost 50 of the men under my command were wounded, 35 in one incident. I have been involved in fatality shootings, several. And I think I've got the right to speak for Northern Ireland veterans today. We were sent to Northern Ireland by you, us, our predecessors. We were sent in, I think, August or September 1969, the Gloucesters went. And we were sent to Northern Ireland to save lives, to look after people. And frankly, we were given this card, this yellow card, which was approved by Parliament. And this yellow card told us what we could and what we could not do under fire. We trained very hard on it. We memorised it. We rehearsed it, as other colleagues here are nodding their heads. We practised on exercise incidents so that we would learn. Army training screams out against opening fire in peacekeeping. That decision is an incredibly difficult decision to make, and it's very difficult in an urban environment because soldiers are thinking, and they are thinking, if I open fire, who else am I going to hurt? How many times did I see instances of our soldiers not firing when they were under fire because the possibility was children or women would be caught in the crossfire? And that particular tactic was used by our opposition. So there is huge inhibition to opening fire. And that decision has to be made by our young men, and by the way, I did work with some young women on operations, not in the infantry. That decision is made in milliseconds. And when it's judged, when their actions are judged, it's in some courtroom, warm and nice with time and lawyers, actually, and you're judging a decision made by someone who's panicking like hell. A long time ago, my right honourable friend is right, a long time ago. And remember, most of our young men were about 18 or 19 years old. and they were kids. I'm looking back at my own soldiers now, and I think they're in sort of year 9 or 10 at school. They look so young. Firearms were used as a last resort. Here it says, in capitals, firearms must only be used as a last resort. And that was drilled into us. A challenge had to be given. A challenge before you could open fire. Unless, of course, it says here, it would increase the risk of injury or death to others or yourself. And that challenge was clear. Army, stop or I fire. Opening fire was only allowed if lives were endangered by, again the yellow card is specific, someone firing a weapon at you or someone you're protecting, someone planting an explosive device or throwing an explosive device, and specifically it refers to a petrol bomb. 1/3 of my platoon were injured by petrol bombs in 1970 on the streets of Londonderry, Rossville Street, William Street Junction. 1/3 burnt, and we hadn't opened fire at all. And neither did we. Driving a vehicle at a person. If someone's driving at you, you're allowed to open fire. Or, finally, if a terrorist has killed someone or is in the act of killing someone, you can open fire if you cannot make an arrest in any other way. We could only open fire with aimed shots, not machine guns. We didn't do it automatic, aimed shots. We had to use the minimum fire. This again is on the yellow card. And we had to be careful that we didn't hit innocent people. And that little phrase stopped so many British soldiers firing, particularly in Belfast Falls Road. I give way to my right honourable friend.
On that particular point, does he recall, as I do, being drilled into our heads that a 7.62 round would travel through 2 levels of brick and kill something on the other side, which often gave our soldiers hesitation, even when thinking about returning fire?
The right honourable is absolutely right. We were petrified, actually, most men on the ground, that they would, by accident, kill an innocent person. And that was a factor in the decision to open fire in those milliseconds. In the case of a fatality, and I was involved in this, in such an investigation, I know what happens. The Royal Ulster Constabulary and the Royal Military Police, the Special Investigation Branch, haul you over the coals. Even though we've just acted to save our lives or someone else's life, we are treated as though we've done something wrong. Soldiers are separated, they're questioned individually, they are actually kept in isolation, they're not given assistance, and they have a very uncomfortable interview. Weapons they used are seized and checked, and all the ammunition is counted, and you have to account for every single round. This is what happened to our men and some women when they were involved in fatality shootings. Detailed reports were produced, and this is the problem. Detailed reports were produced and are usable by the Director of Public Prosecutions and dug up. Some people go to court. In 1978, I had a very uncomfortable interview with 2 soldiers that were working with me. They were not infantry. I told them they had to go to court and they would be charged with manslaughter. They went ballistic. They said, "Sir, you bloody officer, you are actually going to ditch us. You're going to abandon us. You're going to let us go to a court." And I felt rotten. Because actually, I agreed with them. But the Royal Ulster Constabulary told me that I had to instruct the soldiers to go to court and I had to support them, because if they went to court on a charge of manslaughter and that court proved there was no case to answer, the case would be dismissed and they would never hear about it again. Well, will they? We always acted within the law. If we didn't, as we've heard already, we should be prosecuted. But this card was given to us by our predecessors as a protection as well as instructions as to how we should act. Terrorists just disappear. There's no record of what they've done. They just kill. As my right honourable friend, actually for Newbury, has said, we must not judge them the same way as soldiers. It's so easy to go after men in uniform who actually went out at our bidding and acted within the law and everything was written down. It's so much more difficult to get evidence on a terrorist. These terrorists, they just disappear. And then they get these letters. I know the letters don't give them immunity, but it seems like they do to the men and women who are veterans, who I'm trying to represent. It seems like our governments, because it included the Labour government as well, our governments are getting these guys get out of jail cards. And our veterans, and there are so many of them, feel really bitter about that. It's unsurprising that there is huge anger among the veteran community. Quite rightly, they ask, what are you, members of Parliament, doing to help us? You sent us there. You gave us this bloody card. You said if we used this and acted in accordance with it, we'd be protected. Now, our soldiers need protection. They need our protection. How can soldiers and policemen and members of the Ulster Defence Regiment, we've got some representatives here, how can they be considered in the same light as a terrorist? As my right honourable friend for Newbury said, these guys, they went out to kill. We went out to save lives. There's a difference in intention, a huge difference in intention, and we actually have got to sort this matter out. Terrorists didn't give a damn who they killed. I have held people dying. Women, young girls, one 18-year-old girl. She happened to be a Catholic. They didn't give a damn who they killed. And it was terribly, terribly upsetting. And our men and our women who served in uniform require us to act. We need a statute of limitations for Northern Ireland veterans. It is absolutely appalling. It's absolutely right that we have a statute of limitations for people serving outside the UK. But what is the difference between someone putting on a uniform who's likely to be shot more in Northern Ireland than someone doing it in Iraq or Afghanistan. I can tell you, in Northern Ireland, our casualty rate was pretty big. And if you look at the casualties we had in Northern Ireland, they sort of outstrip the casualties we've had in Iraq and Afghanistan. And not just that, the people that were really badly injured. I've got 3 who lost their legs. We cannot, colleagues, consider our servicemen and servicewomen in the same light as terrorists. I'm ashamed, actually, that our governments, I say governments because I include Labour, the Coalition and our present government, are complicit, because that's the way that our men and women look at it, are complicit in a witch hunt against them. Now, these are old soldiers. Many are in their 70s. I'll be there in a couple of months. In the army, when we really wanted to sort something out, people would be told, get a grip. Get a grip. I think it's time our government and our ministers got a grip. Thank you, Mrs. Moon.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Moon. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I just start by paying tribute to the Right Honourable Member for Beacon? I don't think there's any member of this House that doesn't have a deep affection for the Honourable Member. He is held in high esteem, and that was probably one of the most powerful contributions many of us will hear over years in this House. It lays out starkly, Mrs. Moon, the challenge that we face. We spend a lot of time in this House bantering with one another, sharing bonhomie, referring to those that served as gallant men. But we've just heard the cries, the calls for help. No matter how well we wish to dress on the 11th of November and honour those that have honoured us, we've just heard the challenge to us as parliamentarians, that the job is not done, that it's okay being honourable and recognising sacrifice, but when our men need us, and they do, we have to act. Mrs. Moon, this debate has come at a most opportune time. Members of this House will know from comments that I've made publicly last week my deep disappointment that the sounds coming from the Ministry of Defence envisage legislative protection for armed personnel, but not those that served in Northern Ireland. Mrs. Moon, you know me. We served together on the Defence Select Committee. You know the history and you've heard the stories and you know the experience of people who have lived in or served in Northern Ireland. They deserve our support. I have enormous time for the Minister of State. He shouldn't be here today. We can't talk as a nation about our commitment to those who served us and yet delegate anything that happened in Northern Ireland to the Northern Ireland office. When as a country we established an Armed Forces Covenant and we said we had a commitment to those who served, it wasn't caveated. We didn't say one system for those who live in England, Scotland and Wales, one system for those that live in Northern Ireland. We didn't say if you happen to serve in Northern Ireland, you'll be treated less than someone who happened to serve overseas. When we talk of sacrifice, we recognise it as such. It doesn't come in different grades. It doesn't come in different forms. It doesn't require a different response, Mrs. Moon. And when I read the response to this petition, I do want to commend not only the petitioners but also the Honourable Member for Southport, who I think admirably commenced this debate. The government is right when they say any proposal should be consistent with the rule of law. Of course they're right. They are right when they say that criminal investigations and prosecutions are a matter for police and prosecuting authorities who act independently of government and politicians. But they are wrong to fail to seize the challenge which is for us. We set the rule of law in this country. As parliamentarians, it is our duty to set the parameters through which our prosecutors operate, through which our police operate, and we have a problem, Mrs. Moon. When the government say that they are going to consult on proposals, when they await the responses for the Stormont House Agreement or the proposals for a statute of limitations, we should ask this question. What consultation was there for the odious on-the-runs letters? None. But the political proponents for the IRA asked for it, the Labour government gave it, and the Conservative government continued to operate the scheme. And we know John Downey, responsible for the Hyde Park bomb, walked free as a direct result of that on-the-runs scheme. No public consultation, no putting it through the prism of the NIO to see what views are amongst political parties or within the general public. The deal was done. Government provided the cover that terrorists sought. They didn't ask us. They didn't ask the public view in Northern Ireland. They didn't ask people's view whether it was appropriate to give a get-out-of-jail-free card to those who destroyed society or attempted to destroy society in Northern Ireland. Of course not.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I have a constituent who served many tours on Knockbanner, and he highlighted to me one line in the government response that the honourable gentleman mentioned, which is the government states that we do not support amnesties or immunity from prosecution. And I'm afraid his response is, and I wonder if the honourable gentleman agrees, hiding behind legal process when in fact everyone and their dog knows that it is a political process. Otherwise, how could it be possible to amnesty terrorists at the same time as you're prosecuting soldiers is entirely incomprehensible.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm very grateful for that intervention and for the contribution from your constituent veteran. He is right. I stand here. I don't support an amnesty. I will never support an equivalence between terrorists and those who stand up for law and democracy and order in our country. Never. They are not the same. But no member of our Defence Select Committee, when we published our report 18 months ago, supported an amnesty either. When a statute of limitations was proposed, it was very constrained in its ask. It recognised, firstly, the state had to discharge its duty under Article 2 of the ECHR. And as the Honourable Member for Beckenham said, all of these cases were investigated. Secondly, there is no preclusion to a second prosecution if there was new and compelling evidence, and the Honourable Member for Plymouth South was right to ask the question, well, what's meant by that? But the distinction between an amnesty and a statute of limitations is acute. And there needs to be much more thought given to it. Where the state has discharged its duty, where there has been a satisfactory investigation, where a veteran has been told, sir, you have no case to answer, go home, then they should be allowed to get on and live their lives. Unlike the scores and scores and scores of terrorists in Northern Ireland who live with no fear of prosecution. Of course,
entirely concur with every word he's saying, and while paying my respects to our veterans, may I also pay my respects to him and for the courage he shows in all none, because that threat is still here today, and let's make no bones about that. Does he agree with me, and sadly, that's what I fear, and certainly the veterans I speak to, that it's fear of more terrorism that is preventing the judicial process from taking its lawful course and bringing these thugs to justice?
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. I think he's right, and thank him for his personal comments toward me. I am one of the lucky ones, Mrs. Moon, in that as a member of a party of 10, I haven't faced what my colleagues have faced, their families have faced, and the threat that they endured over many years. And I am grateful for that. Society in Northern Ireland has moved on. But this fear of invoking something which is wrong cannot be right. It cannot be the path on which our government walks. There was some suggestion over the course of the weekend and last week that the reason Northern Ireland's not included is our fault, Mrs. Moon. It's the Democratic Unionist Party's fault. I've heard it said over the last 6 months it's the confidence and supply partners that are holding back the expansion of this proposal. Let me nail that myth today. I think anyone that serves with me on the Defence Select Committee knows my position, knows our party's position. We will never stand up or for an amnesty which equates terrorists with service personnel. But we will work for and provide the protection our service personnel need. I have a letter here, Mrs. Moon, that we sent to the Prime Minister on the 31st of October. As we have done in the past, we reiterate again that we will vigorously oppose any attempt to introduce an amnesty for the criminal actions of illegal terrorist organisations. There can be no legal or moral equivalence made between the armed forces acting under the rule of law and terrorists who acted outside the rule of law. Affording legal protection in the form of a statute of limitations or a similar mechanism to the armed forces and those who served alongside them, including the Royal Ulster Constabulary, will not mean an amnesty for anyone. This was the conclusion of the Defence Select Committee report, and it is a point of view we will uphold. And I just want to share that, Mrs. Moon, for clarity in this debate. Of course, whenever we're faced with a challenge like this, we shouldn't be surprised. Governments of various hues only find it within their gift to respond to the call for our armed service personnel when the cost of not doing so is higher than the cost of doing so. That's true in my experience of the Armed Forces Covenant in Northern Ireland, where we have ministers, because of their own political prejudice, who say, I'm sorry, the Armed Forces Covenant does not apply here. I've shared correspondence with members in this House from Michelle O'Neill, the leader of Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, the former Health Minister, who wrote just that as the Minister for Health in Northern Ireland. The Armed Forces Covenant does not apply here. She was wrong. It was a national commitment. Do we have a government which is prepared to enforce that national commitment and repay the trust and the service of our armed forces personnel in Northern Ireland? No, we don't, Mrs. Moon. At least not yet. Whenever Joanna Lumley was campaigning for Gurkhas, who sought to have the right of abode in this country if they served before 1997, government said no continually. It was only in the dying throes of the Gordon Brown government that they finally acquiesced, because the cost of not doing so was causing them too much trouble in the run-up to an election. That's not how we should be honouring those who protected us, Mrs. Moon. Now, if I could I want to share some context for the rest of this debate, not for the rest of my speech, Mrs. Moon, but for the rest of this debate. I want to share some context about Bloody Sunday. And I recognise entirely the mention that was made at the start. So I'm not going to go into specifics about the day. I'm not going to breach any of our conventions about what is sub judice and what is not. That would be inappropriate to do so. But Bloody Sunday happened on the 30th of January, 1972. And anyone that has taken the opportunity to look at the Savile report, hear from families, understand the hurt that they have experienced, heard from our Prime Minister at the time that it was unjustified and unjustifiable, we know that that was a dreadful day. 1972 in Northern Ireland was a dreadful year. 1972 in Northern Ireland saw more murders than any other. 258 people lost their lives. If you take the 3 weeks before the 30th of January, on the 5th of January 1972, Keith Bryan of the Gloucester Regiment was murdered by the IRA. On the 12th of January 1972, RUC Reservist Constable Raymond Denham was murdered in his workplace by the IRA. On the 13th of January 1972, a UDR and site foreman was murdered by the IRA. On the 21st of January 1972, Private Charles Stenterford of the Devon and Dorset Regiment was murdered by the IRA. On the 27th of January in 1972, in the Craigan, in Londonderry, Sergeant Peter Gilgun of the RUC and Constable David Montgomery of the RUC were both murdered by the IRA. That was a Catholic sergeant and a Protestant constable serving together, returning to their or to their RUC station together, having sought to protect and defend the integrity of our society together, both murdered by the IRA. And on the 28th of January 1972, Constable Raymond Carroll was murdered by the IRA. So only when you hear those names and the range of dates only 3 weeks before that you recognise the circumstances and the pressure under which people were serving. And the Honourable Member for Beckenham focused his remarks on the yellow card. That yellow card was not the be-all and end-all. That yellow card was revised in the 80s because it was seen to be too complicated. And then when Lee Clegg was convicted in the 90s, it was changed again. We've taken evidence on the yellow card not being worth the paper it's written on. And yet those were the rules of engagement that our service personnel were told that's what they have to abide by. So we had Bloody Sunday and Bloody Friday and Claudy Baum, all in 1972. During that 3-week period, I mentioned 4 members of the IRA were killed. 2 innocents were killed as well. On the 8th of January 1972, Peter Gerard Woods was murdered by Loyalists in North Belfast, and on the 18th of January 1972, Sidney Agnew, who would have been a constituent of mine, was murdered by Republicans. I don't see there being a fair reflection of that circumstance or that atmosphere or that experience in any court process today. I am deeply disappointed by the level of legal support that the MOD offer service personnel in that situation today. I am deeply disappointed that unlike the scores of groups that our government funds to research these cases on behalf of victims and their families in Northern Ireland, that our Ministry of Defence does not take an overview from one case to the next, that they don't contextualise the support that they give, that there is no equivalence on the documents that are retained by the state used against our state and those that protected our state. This petition today, Mrs. Moon, as I say, is opportune. And so far, all the contributions we have had this afternoon ask us to do more. When I asked the Attorney-General on the 31st of January this month whether any proposal brought forward by the government would apply equally across this United Kingdom, he not only said yes, he said it would be plainly wrong to do anything else. I hope he's right.
Yeah, well done.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mrs. Moon. And I start by paying tribute to my honourable friend for Southport for his initiative in bringing this debate to the House and the way in which he presented the case, and to all other subsequent speakers who, without exception, have made powerful and well-informed contributions. I wish briefly just to answer, perhaps in part, the question posed by my honourable and gallant friend for Beckenham in his extremely powerful contribution when he asked, what are you doing about it? And I can perhaps throw a little light on one aspect, which is what the Defence Committee has been doing about it. And as has been referred to several times already, we have produced one inquiry report and had a response to that report from the government, and now we are working on another one. Why are we having to do a second report and a second inquiry into what amounts to largely the same material? It's because of something rather strange that happened when we produced our first report. Our first report was produced in April 2017. It was the 7th report of the 2016-17 session, and it was entitled Investigation into Fatalities in Northern Ireland Involving British Military Personnel. And I will just read one of its conclusions and one of its recommendations. The conclusion was, "It is clear from the experience of these legacy investigations that unless a decision is taken to draw a line under all troubles-related cases without exception, they will continue to grind on for many years to come, up to half a century after the incidents concerned." In its reply, and we had to wait rather a long time for the government's reply, which eventually came in November 2017, rather later than the usual 2 months that one normally expects. The comment underneath was, "The government notes the committee's comment." More interesting and more positive, however, was the government's response to the recommendation that I'm about to quote from our original report, which read as follows. "Accordingly, we recommend the adoption of what we called Option 1, the enactment of a statute of limitations covering all troubles-related incidents up to the signing of the 1998 Belfast Agreement, which involved former members of the armed forces. This should be coupled with the continuation and development of a truth recovery mechanism, which would provide the best possible prospect of bereaved families finding out the facts once no one needed to fear being prosecuted." In other words, adopting what might loosely be called the Nelson Mandela model from South Africa. Now, the government's reply was as follows. "While the government believes that the most effective option to address Northern Ireland's past is to implement the proposals set out in the Stormont House Agreement, the government acknowledges that others have different views on the best way forward, including approaches such as that proposed by the committee, which do not involve recourse to the criminal justice system. As such, the government intends to include within its forthcoming consultation on the draft Northern Ireland Stormont House Agreement Bill, a section entitled, quotes, Alternative Approaches to Addressing the Past. This section of the consultation will discuss alternative ways forward and include a description of the committee's recommendation. The consultation will invite respondents to give their views on, quotes, the potential effectiveness and appropriateness of alternative approaches such as amnesties and a statute of limitations. I'm glad they didn't identify the two as being the same, because as was so clearly pointed out by the honourable gentleman from Belfast East, they are not the same. To address the legacy of Northern Ireland's past. Following the consultation's conclusion, the government will consider all views carefully to inform next steps. Now, I need hardly remind anybody participating in this debate that that did not happen. When the consultation appeared, there was no reference to the suggestion of a statute of limitations. And the only way that I can find an explanation for this is that somebody behind the scenes lobbied someone in a position to decide this, that the option of a statute of limitations should in fact be excluded from the consultation. Now, I only know what I have seen in a newspaper report that I think has come out very recently, suggesting that there was some correspondence between the Prime Minister and other cabinet ministers. What I have no doubt about is that at the time that our original report came out, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland was James Brokenshire, and he I believe, subscribed to the answer that we got when we received the response to the consultation. Subsequently, sadly, for medical reasons, he temporarily had to leave the cabinet, and there was a change of personnel.
And I suspect, I put it no more strongly than that, that with a new Northern Ireland Secretary, those people behind the scenes in the Northern Ireland office maybe felt that they had a better opportunity to kill a proposal which they might feel would somehow endanger what had been constructed to stop the terrorist violence in the past. I am unconvinced that that is an honourable approach for the government to have taken. Now, I just want to make one other point, because there are so many people who wish to speak that I don't want to labour things too much longer. But the reason, obviously, that we immediately started another inquiry was that when we saw that the consultation had come out without our recommendation even being included for consideration, we thought, right, well, if that's the way the government are going to play it, we shall start the whole process all over again. And that's what we're doing, and we're at an advanced stage in our re-examination, though this time we are examining the wider picture of service personnel at risk of prosecution as a result of other conflicts in foreign countries. And I do not wish to understate the importance of the progress that the government appears to have made in moving towards a solution to that problem at least. And I welcome that, and I hope they don't get cold feet about what they are now proposing to do. So it is good that the government have worked together, and in this respect I must pay tribute both to the previous Defence Secretary and the Defence Secretary before him, both of whom I think did take this issue very seriously. And under the previous Defence Secretary, a special unit was set up in the Ministry of Defence, as this committee had long advocated privately, to try, as my honourable and gallant friend says, to get a grip once and for all on this matter. And we did, as a committee, meet informally with that unit. So progress is undoubtedly being made. We do have this problem, understandably, that people on the paramilitary side of the argument don't want any of their personnel to be pursued for anything they did, but they are adamant that the servants of the British state must be prosecuted till the end of time. And people who rightly point out that the servants of the British state had very different intentions from the terrorists naturally take the view that they don't want any equality, and we've heard it in this debate forcefully expressed, between service personnel doing their duty and terrorists trying to destroy innocent people. However, in one respect, I slightly disagree, and this is just my personal view. But I believe that one must focus attention on one piece of legislation that has not been mentioned yet today, and that is the 1998 Sentencing Act. Because under the 1998 Sentencing Act, even if you've killed 50 people, you cannot go to jail for more than a maximum of 2 years. Now, I speak from some understanding of the position of families who lost a loved one under unexplained and unresolved circumstances like this, because my own family were caught up in the Holocaust of the Second World War. And I must say, I was not terribly keen on statutes of limitations for Nazi guards from Auschwitz, for example. But if somebody had said to me then, there is no question of anybody serving a sentence that is in any way proportionate to murdering somebody and in any way a recompense for doing that, would I then have felt that it was perhaps more important to bring out the truth than to try and get someone who didn't want to tell the truth to go to jail for a derisory period of 2 years? I think I would have wanted more to to discover what really had happened. And that, I think, is the strength, and I close with this, of the Nelson Mandela approach. Because the Nelson Mandela approach was to understand that you can only heal society at a certain point by drawing a line, and you can only find out the truth at a certain point by removing the threat of prosecution. And when you know that as a result of prosecution, the maximum sentence that can be imposed is so risibly, disproportionately lenient compared with the crime that someone would have been found guilty of, then it is easier than ever to understand that that is the civilized and the sensible way forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jim Shannon.
It's a pleasure to speak in this. Can I first of all thank the honourable gentleman for Southport for raising the issue and giving us a chance to participate and contribute to this debate. Declare an interest as a former member of the Ulster Defence Regiment and also in the Territorial Army for 14.5 years. I was just reminded of the honourable gentleman for Beckenham in the yellow card, and some 45 years ago was an 18-year-old, and I can remember during the Ulster Defence Regiment, and that yellow card was preached into us every night before we went out. We were very clear what it meant. I have to say that Miss Moon and I never had the opportunity, and I thank the Lord I never had, to actually fire my gun in anger. It's something I never ever had the chance to do. Never was in a position to do that, and never was confronted with it. Can I thank the honourable gentleman for Beckenham? If you don't mind me picking out amongst other ones who have spoken, because they've all spoken exceptionally well, but he certainly displays the leadership and the courage that many of this House respect him for, not only in uniform in Northern Ireland, but in this House as well. I don't think he probably maybe really understands Miss Moon just how much we all consider him as a friend. Also a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman for New Forest East and his contribution that he makes, as he always does, in the defence chair of the Defence Committee, but always with that honesty and that calmness that gives us a chance to participate and understand. My humble friend for East Belfast, I'm not going to leave him out because I thought he was exceptional, and he encapsulated what we all think as well in this matter. How topical on the day after a memorandum is leaked from Downing Street, which, according to the Sunday Telegraph, states that veterans should be offered equal rather than preferential treatment relative to other groups covered by the plan to investigate historical killings. Equal rather than preferential. Let us for a moment, Ms. Moon, consider this idea, which at first view seems to be right and proper. Were this to be a normal situation that soldiers are treated the same as the normal Joe Blogs on the streets, it would be right and proper. But that assumes that we are all starting from an even playing field. It assumes that the soldier in uniform has decided of his own bat to take a weapon and enter a mission hall in Darkley, open fire, killing men whose crime was to worship their God in church. It assumes that officers have chosen to pull over a vehicle, take out 10 Protestant workmen and kill them as a Roman Catholic member run to safety. It assumes that the soldiers set up a honey trap and tricked 3 young men to their death. It assumes that these officers set a bomb to murder 4 UDR men at Ballydugan and Downpatrick, 3 of whom I knew personally. It assumes that these soldiers knowingly placed a bomb on a busy shopping street and gave false information as to the position to secure maximum death and destruction. For all things to be equal, Miss Moon, rather than preferential, this is where all of these inquiries should start. An acts of terrorism with a determined and planned aim is very, very different. This is not our starting point here with these investigations, and that is why things are not equal, never mind preferential. These incidents began from the second there was a call to say there's a suspicion of terrorist activity. These actions took place when soldiers looked to their officers for advice and rely on training. And the yellow card, which says if you're being attacked, it's okay to defend yourself, what the honourable member from Beckenham very clearly illustrated. The events took place when unlawful terrorists were attempting to kill these men, or at the very least, to all intents and purposes, were attempting to kill them. The actions of soldiers were reactions to the environment around them, an environment which allowed them to relax for not even a second, lest they lose their lives or watch their brothers murdered by the very people who cry out now for preferential treatment and a rewrite to justify that which is unjustifiable. And that's what I'm saying. And that is why, Madam Moon, Ms. Moon, and I also have to say very respectfully, that is why the Prime Minister is yet again flawed in trying to rationalise and equalise everything in Northern Ireland. It grieves me to say that about my Prime Minister, about our Prime Minister, but that's the way I feel. They are not equal and cannot be equalised. You cannot and must not attempt to equate a soldier in uniform with a terrorist. Yes, feel free to equate the murders of the IRA with those carried out by loyalist terrorists. They were outside of the law and unacceptable and despicable. They try for a second to allow Republicans to rewrite our history and equate the actions of a soldier with a legally held weapon in an instructed situation to uphold law in order to those of someone with an illegal weapon and a determination to bomb and murder his or her way to their political end game is horrifying. And I believe, Ms. Moon, it must end here. The soldiers are not asking for equal or preferential treatment. They're asking the government, our Prime Minister, to put them into situations that were so life-changing and horrific, to acknowledge that the government who asked them to carry actions to save us in this place from having to deal with evil men of bloodlust and a desire to wipe out any and every person who dared consider himself to be British. I'm British and very proud to be British, or even to speak with those who were. They are asking the government who trained them and told them what was acceptable and not in times of attack. They are asking us in this place, today, in this debate, on all the debates and all the times we've had an opportunity to speak on these matters, to simply be honourable and to do right by them. And that's what this debate's about. It's doing right for our soldiers. And that's why it's very important to put that on record. I served in the streets of Northern Ireland, as I said earlier on. I listened to the unforgettable wails of mothers when they were told they would never see their children again. We've all lost loved ones, Ms. Moon, that's no secret in this world. We've also lost friends as well. My cousin Ken Smith was a sergeant in UDR and a former B Special, murdered with his Roman Catholic friend Daniel McCormick. No one ever made accountable for that.
Johnny Mercy.
I pay tribute to my honourable friend. He's giving a very moving speech. Would he agree with me that as we've talked so much about equivocation today, that it is simply not acceptable for a Prime Minister of this country to stipulate that veterans should receive equal treatment, not preferential to other groups in this conflict, like the IRA, but equal treatment with the other groups in this country. And that demonstrates a mindset that is fundamentally out of keeping with justice that this is all about.
Yeah. Well done, John.
Jim Shannon.
I thank my friend for intervening. What annoys me is the three people who killed my cousin Kenneth and Daniel McCormick. Excuse me. One of them blew himself up in a bomb in IRA. He's in hell today and deserves what he's got. The second person died from cancer. There's one person left. None of those three, Madam Moon, were ever made accountable for the murders of Kenneth and Daniel McCormick. A Roman Catholic who just happened to be a former member of those defence regiment. The IRA murdered more Roman Catholics than the IRA than the soldiers ever shot. I mean, the whole thing is the reality of Northern Ireland, not because I've lived there all my life, and others have served there and served with such courage and credit to them, and others in this chamber as well who will speak after me, and I know there's many here who will make their contributions. But I lost friends as well in the police, who I think it was Stuart Montgomery, only 18, had only out of the police academy and murdered within a month outside Pomeroy with his friend. Where's the accountability for those families, for their loved ones? And the three UDR men I mentioned earlier on from Ballydugan, I knew three of them men personally, and knew them from an early stage. Where was the accountability in this process for those who murdered those four UDR men? One person was made accountable for a small part of it, but the man who murdered him, he was never held accountable for that, Miss Moon. Although he did meet his Justice Urch in Downpatrick shortly after that, when he was in the process of blowing up or trying to blow up more soldiers. So again, justice, in a way, has happened. Repulsive murderers who have the freedom to justify what they did, and indeed to walk these halls free from prosecution and free from real justice. I hear them again and feel the searing pain as I read of the latest example of the fact that our Prime Minister, again, has no idea of what we as a nation have went through in an attempt to wrap up legacy issues and tie a bow around it. Happy to, yes.
Real emotion, and that rawness shows how poignant these events can be many decades after they occurred. And I wanted to share a very powerful sermon I listened to in church yesterday from a military chaplain who was talking about the 50 to 60 bodies that are discovered each and every year in the fields of France and Belgium, and the services that he undertakes to ensure that those people have a proper burial and that their descendants are contacted. And it reminded me of the ongoing pact that we have as a nation to the people who have served and given their lives for us. And I just want to know whether he shares my constituents' instinctive concern and a sense of shame that the approach taken to those soldiers being prosecuted many, many years after events diminishes that sense of ongoing pact between nation and those who have risked their lives for it.
Thank the Honourable Lady for that intervention, and yes, I wholeheartedly agree with her and what she said. I think there's nobody in this House today that would have any different opinion. I make myself available, Ms Moon, as others do in this House, to help the Prime Minister understand what is clearly beyond her at this point. Upholders of law and order don't deserve to be treated equally with murdering scum of any religion. They deserve to be treated differently because it was different for them. It was different for them in uniform than it was in any other place. I stood shoulder to shoulder in service then, Madam, and I stand shoulder to shoulder now with those in service. And I want them to know that, and that's why this debate is so important. And other contributions will underline that. The blood of those I loved and the blood of those who gave all their all in service to Queen and country cries out not for equality, but for truth and honour and real justice from those who should know better. We should know better in this House, and there is no excuse for this memo or indeed for any deviation to support for those who were not terrorists but law enforcers. There is a difference, a very clear difference in my mind and the mind of everybody else here. It is not equal. Take them out of the same bracket and be honourable.
Johnny Mercer.
Thank you very much, Mr Moon. And I don't need to add to some of the incredible speeches we've heard today, particularly from individuals who served in Northern Ireland, of which I didn't. But I just want to add 2 or 3 new points before not taking up too much time for other colleagues. People are very well aware of my general feelings on this subject, and I pay tribute to the member for Southport for securing this debate. But this is not a niche issue. This is not a niche issue for those who've served or those who have a particular interest in this. This is as basic an injustice as we've seen in this House for some time. And I would urge colleagues to think about what more can be done. When the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement went through and these settlements were reached, it was deemed that it was more politically tolerable for soldiers, servicemen and policemen to take the hit rather than other sides. And that is why we are where we are now, simply because it was more politically tolerable for politicians to do that. And I would just urge my colleagues to do whatever is required to make sure that this government does not just continually speak warm words that ultimately mean nothing, I'm afraid, and actually holds them to account for those who need it. The Minister, I know personally, and none of my remarks are directed at him. I know he has recently taken over that job. But the revelations on the weekend that this Prime Minister would has a clear mindset that those who served should have treatment equal to, and her words were equal to, not preferential to, those who served, is genuinely shocking. And many, many people have written to me over the last 2 days on the back of that specific sentence, which to my mind reminds me, 3 years ago I was in here with the now Secretary of State for Defence. She was then Minister for the Armed Forces. And I remember doing this on the Iraq Historical Allegations team. And this is the point I want to speak to in this, is that nothing ever seems to change. We say a hell of a lot in this place. I remember her looking up at me and saying, no one hears from these investigative teams first, these private investigators. And that morning I'd been on the phone to someone who had heard from them first. And, you know, MPs here who recount their experiences, they're not just turning oxygen into CO2 for the hell of it, right? This actually means something. This is people's everyday. And I know that the responses will be, we're thinking about this and we're thinking about that. But there has been a clear moral failure by this Prime Minister, by the Northern Ireland office, to deal with this situation. And I'm afraid it simply cannot go on. This is, as many members have alluded to, this is not about whitewashing history. And I would just urge colleagues to be really careful with the language they use around this. Last Thursday morning, and this wasn't colleagues, but in the newspapers, on the front of The Guardian, it said, and let me get these words right, but it said something along the lines, mordant to give veterans amnesty for war crimes. Right? Nobody has ever asked for that. Nobody has ever thought about that. Yet this is deliberately inflammatory wording, simply designed to prey on the grief and the hell that some of these families and veterans are going through. An amnesty in this case is not appropriate in any way whatsoever. A statute of limitations on its own, it can't work. There can be no time limitation to serious criminal behaviour. And actually last week, when we began to see the beginnings of a presumption not to prosecute, that is the sort of area we should be working in. And that has come from this Attorney General. Yes, of course.
I entirely endorse what the Honourable Gentleman said, with one proviso. If someone has been investigated by a competent authority, I think a statute of limitations is perfectly acceptable.
So it's a really interesting point my honourable friend raises, and I would simply say that the sort of checks and balances that the Attorney General is talking around a rigorous investigation first, comprehensive and new compelling evidence, should safeguard against precisely what he is talking to. The problem with a statute of limitations per se is that where there is clear evidential thresholds that are met, when it comes to clear wrongdoing behaviour, I think we then start entering difficult areas. But at least it's something that we should be having a conversation about, that this Prime Minister has specifically asked my right honourable friend, the leader of the Defence Select Committee, not to do. I give way to him.
Yes, I wouldn't put it quite as explicit as that, but it certainly was implicit in the way that our report's recommendation was first put forward and then somehow mysteriously excised from the government's agenda. But could I perhaps resolve the point at issue and say that would he accept the term a qualified statute of limitations? Because that's what the government seems to be putting forward in general, which is to say that there will be a presumption against prosecution after 10 years have elapsed, hence the statute of limitation, unless new and compelling evidence emerges, hence the qualification.
Yes, and of course, around this legal language, there are ways out of this. And I think we can do that without using inflammatory terms or mechanisms that people would not agree with. Because what gets lost in a lot of this, I'm afraid, is is there's an impression that individuals like my right honourable friend, the member for Beckenham, or myself, where, sorry?
Right honourable is very good.
Oh, right. Honourable friend.
Honourable and gallant friend.
Honourable and gallant friend, member for Beckenham. You know, there's this impression that, that we have no feelings for the victims in this, that the victims are second fiddle, that there is no effort to pursue justice in any way. You've just heard him talk about cradling an 18-year-old girl as she died in Northern Ireland. And victims and families are getting this because of these legal teams that are dragging them down a pathway where they genuinely get them to believe they may, in the end, have all their questions answered. And there's nothing more disingenuous than using their grief and their anger and their sense of injustice to propel this totally false narrative, which is simply used just to extend the conflict. Of course, I'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I, like many members that have spoken today and that have raised their concerns, have heard from veterans in my constituency and also those that are just deeply affected by this, because does he agree with me as the length of time that this goes on for, we are creating a very difficult narrative that is cutting across people that have served, people that have family members in the armed forces, or just ordinary members of the public who are really disgraced and angered by this situation. And we have recruitment issues as well. And does he agree with me that this poses a very serious threat to those that we are asking to come and serve, that we are not going to protect them?
Look, it's really good points from my honourable friend who represents the constituency of, well, where Arbroath is, Royal Marines Condor in Arbroath. And I would just, in my closing remarks, I just want to get over why I and many others feel so angry about this. There are many burning injustices in this place, but we have been here before. We have been here before. And the problem is, you know, and this is the greatest worry, is that this just will never end. This will never end. Not only for this government, the government that replaces it, these veterans, veterans of the Falklands, veterans of Iraq, veterans of Afghanistan, until a government or a Prime Minister decides to show just a quarter of the courage that we asked our men and women to serve on a daily basis in these conflicts. I cannot, it is just, you know, I don't want to overdo it, but it is just pure cowardice. It is cowardice to say that you are on people's side, to give a conference speech to rapturous applause, that you are on the side of those who serve, bravest of the brave, okay? And in private, say the complete opposite. And I would urge fellow colleagues to stand with me in doing everything possible we can. You know, this is not a game. The nation is at stake. How we defend ourselves is at stake. And I pay tribute to those who served out there, who've given us such inspiring speeches today. There is no more to be said on this subject, frankly, but there is a hell of a lot to be done. And that's what people like me are looking for now.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr Bone, pleasure to serve under you and previously under Mrs Moon. May I agree with my honourable friend for Plymouth Moor view that there isn't an awful lot more to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway. So, because the e-petition demands that we reiterate and reiterate the reality of what has been going on. Now, I haven't really spoken about this subject since pretty much I left Northern Ireland, and I listened with great interest to my honourable friend, the member for Beckenham. And I do congratulate the e-petitioners 243 and 947 for their work in this, and also my honourable friend, the member for Southport, for his very, very good and powerful speech at the beginning. But listening to my honourable friend brought back an awful lot of memories of Northern Ireland. I was, as he describes, a young platoon commander, not that long out of Sandhurst, frankly. I don't know that I learnt very much at Sandhurst, so it had to be all relearnt again after I'd left. But I do remember, most of the time, large periods of incredible, intense boredom, followed by massive periods of panic. and fear, literally almost going alongside each other. I lived in the Masonic car park with my company, and I lived in an old caravan that had a hole on the side by my bed. I was damp the whole time there because the rain lashed through the whole of the winter, and I simply remember the fear quite often in my young guardsmen's eyes when they were caught up in an incident. And the fear didn't come, I think, from the idea of what might happen to them. The fear mostly came, Mr. Bone, from the fear of what they might have to do and get it wrong. This yellow card, which was drilled into us before we left, scared the living daylights out of me before I even set foot in Northern Ireland, and I know the same for my young soldiers. And as my honourable friend said, some of them were 18 years old, literally, levels of education that were very low, and we were expecting them, in an urban environment which they'd never been in, quasi-police force, but armed and in support of the police, to make the kind of judgments that I think highly paid and brilliant legal brains would stall at were they given that moment. These young men were having to make that decision, as my honourable friend pointed out quite rightly, for themselves, and they would bear the burden of the decision that they took by themselves, and too often without support. And I take the point that my honourable friend made from More View, was that I have a real problem, really, with our relationship with the armed forces in this country. We expect them to do the right thing. We expect them to go to war. I still remember my father telling me, who served, I think, with great distinction in the Second World War, but he told me that many friends of his who had been incarcerated in prisoner of war camps, in the prisoner of war camps for a number of years, came home to find their families in near destitution. Why was that? Because the then War Office, deciding that they were now living comfortably in a prisoner of war camp, could reasonably cut their pay in half because they had no need for the other bit of the pay, forgetting or even not bothering to find out that they had dependents living at home who, by the end of the war, were literally in deep poverty and starving. This is the kind, I'm afraid, of relationship that we have percolating through every single post-operation. And we arrive here with our veterans from Northern Ireland in much the same way. A government busy, I'm afraid, and I'm sad to say this, and even previous governments, Labour and Conservative, I use the term government, not necessarily referencing my own, but all governments that have existed, really quite determined to find the reasons why we cannot do things, never finding the reasons why we can. Our servicemen and women do genuinely get put in operations and risk their lives, which they don't complain about, but they do it on the general assumption that a paternal government will somehow oversee their well-being were they either to be wounded, their families hurt, or were they to end up in a difficult situation where they might be prosecuted. And I do find that in too often of the slightly PC conversations that take place outside when governments are interviewed, they start equivocating about who was doing what. So we get equivocation about the terrorists versus the soldiers. You know, when I was over there, I didn't serve with particular distinction, but I do remember having to find a cache of large number of armoured-piercing, Garand, American rifle, armour-piercing rounds. And I thought to myself, they were on the way to somebody to do a snipe on one of our patrol vehicles. They would have gone clean through it. They would have killed anything on the inside that they'd shot. These were terrorists setting up another attack, as my honourable friend said, on people who were there to keep the peace. There is no equivocation. There's no equivalence between those who go out to kill people as their purpose and those who go out to defend people but may end up having to kill people as a result of their trying to defend them. This stands above all else. This is what we do as soldiers. This is what we know we are about. And it is particularly the case, I think, with British soldiers, who I still believe to this day are the best trained and most reasonable and decent troops you will ever get on the ground. They always operate with a real sense of restraint. You don't even have to teach them about that. There is that instinctive sense of restraint. It comes from their training. And what do they find now? That 90% of the cost of these prosecutions, 90% of that is going on 10% of the incidents. Where is the natural justice in that? And I want to raise an issue. I had friends, some of whom who never came back, and particularly I want to talk about Robert Nairac. Robert Nairac I saw a few nights before he went to Northern Ireland. Now, he never returned. It was horrific what happened to him. A brave young man trying to do his job wasn't just killed, but he was tortured. He was dismembered, and he has disappeared, and they have never, ever owned up to where that body was ever buried. No one has owned up to actually doing it, although we have a fair suspicion as to who it was. And his poor parents have gone to their grave with no conclusion to the sad tragedy of Robert Nairac. He is so typical of many, many people, both soldiers and non-combatants, who in Northern Ireland have disappeared. Where is the justice in the fact that people like him and their families will never see those responsible prosecuted for the filthy, foul action that they undertook on that individual and many others? There is no natural justice in pursuing British soldiers because it's easier than pursuing somebody like that or the people that tortured him and killed him because it is too difficult. And worse than that are the letters of comfort that were given. I found this astonishing, that we discover that quietly letters of comfort are given to those who are on the run. Why? Because they have committed atrocities and they can't come back. Now, that's about government and that's about the Belfast Agreement, perhaps. But in a funny sort of way, you know it's not really, because otherwise it would have been publicly done. It would have been shouted from the rooftops if it was an equivalent process, but it never was. And so the endless nightmare I find is that, as my honourable friends have said, that soldiers who served in Northern Ireland were 3 times more likely to die than those terrorists that they were after. And that in many senses, when you balance what actually happened on the streets of Northern Ireland, actually the likelihood of death is greater really, in a sense, scaled up, with other operations that have been before or since. Why was that? It was because our soldiers walked through the streets in plain sight, and they were targets for every single moment they were there. And I must say, Mr. Bone, I do recall categorically the real sheer fear of a young platoon commander myself when the Sunday, the first Sunday that the commemoration of Bloody Sunday fell on that Sunday in the Bogside. I remember having to keep a patrol safe as over 100,000 very angry people were talking about tearing them limb from limb if they found them, and knowing that at any stage any one of them could have been taken away and never be seen again. These were the kind of things and the decisions that you had to make, which still resonate even today. And so, Mr. Bone, I simply urge the government ultimately to do the right thing. And the right thing is to recognise that this is quite ridiculous that soldiers that have been cleared in a previous investigation should ever be pursued again unless there is absolute and categoric, clear, beyond the burden of criminal proof that they have done something which nobody knew about before. They should never face that. These men of whatever age they are now, in their 70s, are facing this now. I think my right honourable friend mentioned that one of them was literally arrested by a stream of police cars and taken away as though he had committed some foul offence immediately and was going to run or something like that. I mean, the overcooking of the nonsense that the police get up to sometimes in these areas is quite ridiculous. I don't want them to be treated differently, but what I do say quite categorically is that if there is going to be some statute of limitations, I recognise that everything we do must also cover veterans of Northern Ireland. At the moment, as I understand it, there is a real issue that those who served in other operations may well get covered by this, but because of the fact that they were serving in the United Kingdom, the UK law will override anything that the government does. Now, that cannot be allowed to be the case. They absolutely cannot be allowed to be the case. And so I serve fair warning on my government that I will simply not put up with the idea that we shunt those veterans of Northern Ireland to one side while seeking some kind of political cover generally as though we had done something. We will not have done anything unless we deal with all of our servicemen and women who have had the bravery and the courage to serve their country. And I simply say, therefore, that there can be no second-class treatment. Now, I know there's a debate about whether it should be just on the basis of new evidence or on a statute of limitations. I am content on this one principle, that no serviceman or women who served in Northern Ireland will be arrested and pursued simply because they have nothing better to do with their time than to find out whether these people actually did something, even though their case was dismissed. It is time the government acted on that. And I urge my honourable friend and his honourable friends to simply recognise that those of us who served in Northern Ireland didn't do so because we asked to. We didn't suddenly volunteer in a fit of passionate patriot or bravery that we would somehow go there of our own. We were told to go there because we were soldiers, and we were told that that was the command. And we went on an operation, which we were told was an operation, not some other affair, which we now seem to hear. And we went on that operation, and we did our duty. Op Banner was an operation. And it...
Thank you very much, Mr. Bone. It was Operation Banner. You did 28 days in Northern Ireland, and you were awarded a General Service Medal, which is the recognised medal for serving in combat zones, Malaya, Suez, Aden, Borneo.
Yep.
And Northern Ireland is actually on the clasp of a General Service Medal. That means it's an operation just like any other one.
I agree. In fact, I made this point the other day that I have an operational service medal for Rhodesia, as it was then, and I have a general service medal with a clasp for Northern Ireland. I assumed that they recognised both as being equivalent operations. I didn't remember a distinction. I'd never been told that you're on a subset of an operation here in Northern Ireland, but you can go on a real operation in Rhodesia. Well, I tell you which of the two was more frightening. It was Northern Ireland, I can tell you without a shadow of doubt. And I therefore say to my honourable friend, he must say in a loud voice to all of those who have the privilege of running departments and even to the Prime Minister herself, that this simply cannot stand. This is a deep injustice. And those out there who served need us to stand up for them, because otherwise they have nobody else. And their families need us to stand up for them, because they will have nowhere else to go. Too often in the past, successive British governments have failed their servicemen and women because they got mealy-mouthed about how to support them. This has to stop. We now must protect them. And I have one last phrase to give him, which is when natural justice collides with the law, we must change the law to protect those who did the protecting of us.
Yeah. Very well said. Richard Drax.
I too pay tribute to my honourable friend from Southport for bringing this excellent speech that started off this debate. And I also pay tribute to all those who've spoken. It is indeed humbling to be surrounded by so many gallant, honourable gentlemen who have served in Northern Ireland or served in our armed forces. Just briefly, so I can introduce where I fit into this, I did 3 tours of Northern Ireland, and I joined on... my first tour was in December 1978. I remember the Sergeant Major at Sandhurst said to me as I left, "Sir, you've got time to say Happy Christmas to your parents, then get your arse over to Northern Ireland." So I said, "Right, thank you very much indeed, that's my Christmas gone." Over I went on the ferry with a great friend of mine, and the difference of leaving the United Kingdom, leaving England and going to Northern Ireland was absolutely marked at that time, 78. I can recall it now. and getting off the ship where we were treated as normal, free civilians and enjoying a drink and a beer and chit and chat, getting off the back of that ferry and into an armoured vehicle known affectionately as pigs. And from that moment on, we drove to our base in Macquarie Park, just off the Falls Road, where I spent the first 6 months of 3 tours. As we drove to Macquarie Park, I simply couldn't believe this was the United Kingdom. It took a huge amount of appreciation to sink in that my country, our country, was as divided by hatred and violence as I was about to witness. On the 20th of July, 1982, after my tour, Lieutenant Anthony Daly was leading the changing of the guard from Hyde Park Barracks to his duty with his men, when the IRA detonated a bomb, a nail bomb, in Hyde Park. A bomb was also laid later at Regent's Park that afternoon and killed members of the Green Jackets who were performing there. I'm sure you will all remember those ghastly pictures of the horses and men splayed across the road, and there's a commemoration stone to Anthony Daly on the spot today. Now, John Downey, an IRA convicted killer, got off because of a letter of amnesty. Now, we've heard many examples from honourable members how the IRA seem to get away from the atrocious deeds they do, and members of our armed forces who go out to save lives, and that point's been made by my right honourable friend from Newbury, and I think also by others. And this is a point I'd like to reiterate, and reiterate again, as my right honourable friend said earlier.
Will my honourable friend allow it, just briefly?
Very happy to give way.
Just briefly, on the point about John Downey, the alleged Hyde Park bomber, is it not correct that when he produced his so-called letter of comfort, the judge abandoned the trial? And yet the government continue to maintain the fantasy that these have no legal power or strength, and yet a judge in charge of a murder trial abandoned it when one such letter was presented. Doesn't that drive a coach and horses to the government's case?
I think it drives a tank through the government's case. And my right honourable friend speak with his characteristic verve and clarity. Absolutely right, so it does. I speak personally now, but my view over many years, I'm 61 now, and I served 9 years in the army, and I've been here for 9 years. My view is that politicians generally, and there are very noble exceptions, many of whom, or all of whom are in this room today, simply don't understand the armed services. They just don't get it. Now, I have a huge amount of respect for my honourable friend, right honourable friend, who I know well, and this comment or any comments I make are not aimed at him personally. And like my right honourable friend, they're aimed at all governments. Because what's the first thing that happens when a government comes to power and they're short of money? They cut the armed services. This is sort of an intentional madness. The armed services are an insurance policy which require money to invest in. And we hope we don't have to use them, but in places like Northern Ireland, we do. If I recall, we had about 35,000 troops in Northern Ireland at the height of the Troubles. I would say we'd be pushed to mount a similar operation of that scale today. In fact, as my honourable colleagues say, it's probably impossible. So my message to the government is if we are going to say all these things about our armed services, and how often do we hear we respect the armed covenant, all these things repeated in the chamber and outside by politicians. But when it comes to the crunch, they are let down. And I just want to touch very briefly on Royal Marine Al Blackman, who I and many others managed to get out of jail, and he served only half his time. Here was a man, and similar to the example I think that was given by an honourable colleague earlier on, the circumstances around which this man was forced to operate in the most appalling conditions in Afghanistan, none of these things were taken into account. It is so easy for politicians who have no experience of operational service to sit in an armchair with their gin and tonic and say, I condemn that man or woman for what they did. What they fail to understand is the total picture under which our brave men and women all too often serve. Mention's been made of the yellow card. I too learnt the yellow card, and if I recall, and I hope I've got my old memory working, one of our main concerns was the vehicle checkpoint.
Oh, yes.
Now, we were told that if, and it often happened, young boys would challenge army checkpoints. And so young kids, teenagers, not related in any way to terrorism, would try and drive through our checkpoints for a laugh. Now, we discussed this on many, many occasions. How do we deal with this? A car coming at you at 50, 60, 70 miles an hour, you have 1, 2, 3 seconds to react, you've got a gun in your hand. Is this a terrorist? Is this a young boy fueled up with drink? Who is this guy? You know, you're thinking this, bang, the car goes into your checkpoint, may kill one of your soldiers or seriously injure them, or a member of the civilian population. The car then drives away. Are you then allowed to shoot the person in that car? The answer we all came to was no, because that person is no longer an immediate danger to you or anyone else. So had someone been shot in that car, there would have been the kerfuffle and the court case and accusations of murder and all the rest of it. So I think this point on restraint has been made, but I'd like to make it again. All those I served with, and the many others I served alongside, all showed restraint. And particularly in riots or in very dangerous areas, where a soldier's instinct when going to someone who's in trouble is to help. It's not to kill or beat up. And the number of times I saw my guardsmen go to the aid in both sides of the community. And as you built up a relationship, the cups of tea, not often, used to increase a little bit. Because the Irish people, most of them, are decent people. A few rotten apples, sadly, spoil the barrel. So can I end by saying, first, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said by all honourable and right honourable friends and gallant friends so far today. And can I urge the government, can we stop what we do best? Talk. Stop talking. Because that's over now. We cannot go on betraying our brave men and women while at the same time telling them they're brave, and then when they come home, sending them straight into a court and throwing them to the mercy of lawyers et al. This is not on. And finally, justice delayed, a similar phrase, is no justice at all.
Well done here. James EP.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bone. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to follow the speeches of so many honourable and gallant friends who have spoken so compellingly about their own service and how that translates into the way they see things now as policymakers. My congratulations also to my honourable friend, Member for Southport, who I thought opened the debate with great clarity, and his speech being very well received by all ex-service people watching. It pains me, however, Mr. Bone, that the Minister to respond to this is my immediate neighbour, the Honourable Member for Weston-super-Mare. He and I are great friends, and I'm afraid that I must not pull any of my punches, but I do rather feel it should be the Ministry of Defence in here responding rather than the Northern Ireland office. Now, Mr. Bone, I am delighted to.
I'm most grateful. I did miss the beginning of the debate. Could I just say to him that I hope he'll join me in saying to the Minister that he needs to address the Stormont House Agreement when he responds to this debate, because I rather fear that the reason we're in this predicament on Northern Ireland veterans is because of the terms of that agreement, and in particular in relation to historical investigations.
I agree very much indeed with my honourable friend. He is right that there is a political angle to this that is most unfortunate, and I will come to that later in my remarks. First of all, though, Mr. Bone, I am just deeply concerned by any suggestion that there is an equivalence between the actions that I and so many other former service personnel have taken on operations and those actions taken by terrorists who were out to illegally take life. There is no equivalence. And in the urgent question on Thursday morning, there was a disappointing line deployed by the government, which seemed to suggest that these letters of comfort would not endure, and that if they didn't endure, that all would therefore be open to prosecution. Well, I simply say that whilst that corrects an imbalance, I'll come to the Honourable Gentleman in just a second, whilst that corrects an imbalance, it by definition creates an equivalence, in which we're basically saying, well, at least both sides can be investigated and prosecuted. And that's simply not acceptable. There is no equivalence at all. I give way.
Very quickly, David Griffith is aged 78. He's a Chelsea pensioner. He killed an IRA gunman in 1972 who was about to assassinate one of his comrades. He was investigated at the time and exonerated. 47 years later, he's being investigated again by the PSNI. They will not tell him his fate. He was an Irish Catholic born in Dublin. Sorry.
The Honourable Member understand if this is sub judice, we shouldn't be pursuing it.
No, it's not sub judice
Okay.
because it's not. No, sorry, Mr. Bone, I completely understand. It's not before a court. I completely understand the intervention. It's not before a court, and the case is in the public domain. Very quickly, he has no letter of comfort. He has no comfort of any kind. He's in utter limbo. He's a Chelsea pensioner, and he's very worried about it. Why does our government allow this to happen?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. There is no equivalence whatsoever. Whether the other side can now be investigated again or not, it is simply unreasonable, wrong, immoral, a breakdown of our covenant with our armed forces that we are allowing the investigation of those who have served to continue. Now, my honourable and gallant friend, the member for Beckenham, gave a quite amazing speech, actually, and in which he reflected that there was a time when his blokes thought that he had thrown them under the bus because they were required to go to court. And it was clear from his speech the pain that he felt in having to look his soldiers in the eye and break that news to them. I suspect that if those soldiers were watching you, Colonel, this afternoon, they would have been very proud to have seen someone that takes the responsibilities of command so seriously years after their watch is done. And I personally found that very powerful. And I think that all of us who have had the great privilege to carry a commission in Her Majesty's Armed Forces and to have command of soldiers, sailors and airmen will relate very strongly to the pain that he so clearly felt, that even now, in another career many years later, we feel like we are letting our riflemen, our guardsmen, our private soldiers down, and that is what motivates us all to be here. The first time that I was involved in any such process was in Kabul in 2005. It was about a year or so after I'd commissioned, and we had been involved in the use of lethal force following a double vehicle-borne suicide bombing. And throughout the afternoon and the evening that followed and overnight as we sort of stood on the perimeter, you go back through everything that you've done and you think tactically whether or not you did the right thing. When you get in the next morning having been relieved and the first thing you get is a date with the Royal Military Police Special Investigations Branch, I was pretty close to throwing punches. What I understand is that that is a very necessary part of applying lethal force on the battlefield. We are trained to live by a higher standard, we are trained to operate by a higher standard, and we should have nothing to fear when the investigation starts immediately on the back of the application of force like that. Years later, or 2 years later in Basra, and then 2 years later in Sangin, this process had become commonplace. Indeed, in Sangin, as a battalion adjutant in the most contested Herrick Tor, in the most contested battle space, I was responsible for an awful lot of these initial investigation processes. And I can tell colleagues that the immediate debrief could not be accurate. Adrenaline was still coursing through the veins of the riflemen that had been involved. They were emotional because very often their friends had lost their legs or been killed in the very same mission. There was confusion about what happened because the fog of war was all around them, and as they relayed their own individual testimonies about what happened that afternoon, that night, that morning, very often it didn't match up with the testimony of the rifleman that stood immediately next to them fighting the same contact. Now, when you consider that in the process of us going through that investigation, it's a company second in command, drafting a report, coming up to the adjutant, us having a look at it, in going off to brigade and the legal advisor looking at it, the special investigations branch having a look at it, that rifleman was deployed on 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more patrols in the next 7 days, in which there would be more kinetic activity, in which they would have applied lethal force, and on the back of which there were more reports by the company second in command coming up to the adjutant, so on and so forth. Very quickly, all of the detail of those missions starts to mesh into one. So much so that we had riflemen go to the coroner's hearings 6, 9 months, a year after the tour and not recognising the contemporary report of what happened that night when they applied lethal force. And the reason that I make that point, Mr. Bone, is that if days after they can't remember exactly what happened, if a year after they can't exactly what happened, is a natural part of the way that we deal with our mental health, that we seek to delete, we seek to overwrite. How on earth can we turn around to people decades later and replay back to them very accurate reports made at the time as part of the evidence against, and ask them to account for themselves in trying to establish their innocence once again? Those of us who have had that moment when a threat is perceived, and you, in the split second, you have to make a decision whether to apply lethal force because your life or the life of another is in danger. I will.
Excellent point. I just wonder whether the IRA terrorist would have all these access to all these, or we, the judge, would have access to all these reports you refer to.
My honourable and gallant friend is absolutely right. The IRA did not keep such records, and that is one of the great unfairnesses that I'll come on to. Those of us who have had that moment, when you've had to apply lethal force, we take it in a split second, and we do so hoping that all of our training, all of our instincts, everything that we've learnt since first going into the Army, Navy, Air Force, will mean that we take the right decision. But we know there's a danger that we might get it wrong. And we need to know that providing that we are within the rules of engagement, providing we can say squarely that we perceive the threat to be there, that our government will stand behind us for the actions that we have taken. Now, the MOD announcement this week, the written ministerial statement that may come tomorrow, is great news for those of us who served on Operation Herrick and Operation Tech. Already, my tour to Afghanistan in 2005 is more than 10 years ago. My tour to Basra in 2007 is already 10 years ago. And at the end of October this year, my final operational tour to Iraq and Afghanistan will also be more than 10 years ago. That should be huge comfort, and it will be, to tens of thousands of veterans who served in those theatres. But as somebody who served in Northern Ireland, and more importantly, as a constituency MP with many constituents who served in Northern Ireland, and as a former rifleman with many ex-rifleman friends who served in Northern Ireland, actually, I'm all right, Jack. And we have to remember that it is not okay to have one statute of limitation that applies to the conflicts that are most obviously in people's conscience, whilst to ignore that those who fought in Northern Ireland in just as trying circumstances, we've heard so many times this afternoon, that they are still left behind. In fact, it makes it worse. The legal premise on which my former comrades served in Northern Ireland is not their fault. The failings of any investigation that happened at the time is not their fault. Conversely, the quality of the investigations that happened at the time that allows vexatious politicians and lawyers to pore over the detail and challenge it decades later, that's not their fault either. The political situation in Northern Ireland now is not their fault. The fact that they pulled the trigger in Northern Ireland rather than in the Falklands or the Balkans or in Iraq or Afghanistan is not their fault. And the fact that the government hasn't done anything about this yet is also not their fault. Mr. Bone, this can't drag on any favour. A universal statute of limitation across all theatres is required, and it's required now. This isn't an amnesty. Our armed forces are not above the law. We ask of them higher standards than in civilian life. And when they fall short, we punish them in a way that would be draconian in any civilian employment setting. But if we understand some of what they do, and many of us in this room do, then we understand why they deserve this protection. We ask of them that they accept an unlimited liability in defence of our nation. We must accept the political liability that comes with saying, come what may, we've got your back.
Yeah. We've got two right honourable members wishing to speak. I have to start the wind-ups slightly before 7 o'clock, so if that could be borne in mind. Owen Patterson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bowen. I will follow your instruction to be brief, because and I apologise to you and Mrs. Moore that I didn't put in. I was unaware that this debate was coming on. So I will be brief, and I will try and keep it simple. I would like to start as someone who was Shadow Secretary of State for 3 years and the Real Secretary of State for 2 years and did business in Northern Ireland when I was younger and continues to go there, to say thank you very much, very sincerely, to all those who are present today who have spoken very movingly, Member Beckenham, Member Strangford, on all that they did and all those people that they represented, the hundreds of thousands of those in the military and the security services who did their level best to maintain the rule of law. And that's what it was all about. It was the most extraordinary insurgency to break the rule of law. And I was in Northern Ireland only 10 days ago talking to a guy who worked up through the ranks, a senior officer, and he was absolutely emphatic. He did not want any amnesty at all, because what he and his men did was to defend the rule of law. Now, we all support the Belfast Agreement, which is an extraordinary achievement. Politically, it had support of both main parties in the UK, both main parties in the Republic of Ireland, and both main parties in the United States. It would never have started without all those brave servicemen and policemen in the security services who maintained the rule of law. It would not have begun. And it's very much thanks to them that Northern Ireland is in such a better position now. And we know that during the talks, the Blair government had to take some hideously difficult decisions, as did the Major government before it. And we know about the infamous letters, but releasing prisoners who had been convicted under due process of the most appalling crimes was an incredibly difficult decision. Releasing prisoners on only 2 years. And that was, for many, bigger at the time, much bigger than this issue of letters. But it's been worthwhile, and we should thank all those who gave it the base, because, bluntly, they made it impossible, those brave men and women, for those pursuing the Republican cause to get their aims by violence. They realised the only way ahead to pursue their aims was by peaceful means. And that was an absolutely remarkable achievement. So where we are today is that we know there are many who wish Northern Ireland to become part of the Republic of Ireland. The political campaign has not gone away. And what we have got to be careful, as the United Kingdom representatives, as the innocent old soldiers don't get drawn into this current political process, because that is what is happening. It is absolute nonsense when a man, and I'll be very careful, your strictures on sub judice, but I've talked to an elderly veteran who had several pieces of paper from military legal departments exonerating him for an incident. And yet, a rural police force, which I thought could have had better things to do, sent half a dozen police cars round to arrest him.
Yeah, it's astonishing.
That just shows this has got completely out of hand. And there is a real sense of grievance and a real sense of injustice, and the government has bluntly got to wake up to this and put it right. Now, the Honourable Member for Wales spoke very well, and Member Beckham too, about how tiny the moments were when decisions were made, which may lead to these processes.
Tiny.
I'm probably one of the very few human beings that's read every page of the Savile report. And I was responsible in Northern Ireland for the various reports that came through from the peace process, which we obviously published and reported to Parliament. But what is critical about Savile, I doubt any country in the world could have gone to such lengths and such expense to really try to get to the truth. And in many parts of this terrible event, Savile is very clear. He does establish what happens. But there are several tiny moments. As the member for Wells said, he struggles for page after page after page. And in some instances, doesn't come to a conclusion. These were split-second moments. They were back in 1972. Yep. Member for Wells just said people couldn't remember a week after. How on earth are people going to remember facts clearly which are new? So my appeal is that there are merits in a statute of limitations. I would leave that to lawyers, and my honourable learned friends about to speak, I think. I think where we are at is that it would be completely wrong if there's a statement made tomorrow by the Secretary of State of Defence that there's one regime for soldiers that have served in one theatre, Afghanistan or Iraq, and a completely different one for those that served under Op Banner. That would be absolutely wrong. As Member Beckenham said, politicians at the time sent these young soldiers to do their duty to defend the rule of law. They weren't told in 30, 40 years' time, sorry guys, you're going to have a different regime because, bluntly, you are being drawn into a contemporary political campaign, which is what is happening. So my appeal to the Minister when he stands, there are two things the government could do now. We don't need statements in Parliament. We don't need new legislation. We need an absolute categoric guarantee from the government that those that have legally valid pieces of paper, exonerating them for incidents in the past, will not be brought to further process unless there is absolutely clear new evidence. And secondly, allied to that, there must not be any process where a fair trial is not allowed. That's a very, very long-standing principle. I'm not a lawyer, but there has got to be clear, absolutely categoric new evidence and absolute assurance from the crossing authorities that the trial will be fair. It would be very good if the Minister could confirm that. Thank you very much.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr Bone. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship today, and I also congratulate the honourable member for having called this and led, rather, this extremely important and topical debate. I always speak in these debates with some trepidation because I can't speak with the authority of the honourable members for Strangford, Beckenham, Chingford, Plymouth Moorview and Wells, who have been there and experienced it. In fact, I'm afraid, Mr Bone, I am one of the lawyers of whom various honourable members have spoken in the course of the debate. But the reason why I do venture to speak a few points is simply to make the point that the abhorrence at lawfare is not confined to those who have served or are serving, but also to those who are lawyers as well. I would like to make the point that lawyers, and I'm a barrister, those who serve at the bar, it's an honourable profession. It is one where you speak for someone who has no voice for themselves, who cannot speak for themselves. Often you will be speaking for someone who is the downtrodden, someone who needs to be listened to and isn't listened to at all. And you will often, members of the bar are fiercely independent-minded. They will say things that are not popular. They will argue causes that no one else wants to argue. But sometimes they are put in the position of having to prosecute law or to defend law which is wrong. And when it's wrong, it's the job of ministers to act and Parliament to approve. So the lawyers are those who are being put in the wrong position, and it is for us here in this place to act. And so it is in this case where the law does need adjustment to right this very great wrong. This is a matter that I feel very strongly about, albeit from a different perspective to those who have already spoken so movingly. I first came across this aspect of lawfare when Lee Clegg, who was spoken of earlier, was on trial for murder when I was about 14 in 1993. And being probably an uppity little fellow, wrote an essay saying how unjust I thought it was that someone who had made such a narrow decision in such trying circumstances was being tried for murder. And that, of course, was a highly controversial case. And I'll explain why I say that. And I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for Beckenham for having given me his yellow card, which is upon which that case turned. If my memory serves me, Article 5A3, you may only open fire on a person if he is committing or about to commit an act likely to endanger life and there is no other way to prevent the danger. The following are some examples of acts where life could be endangered depending upon the circumstances. Thirdly, deliberately driving a vehicle at a person and there is no other way of stopping him. It's the issue about driving at a person that was the point upon which the Clegg trial turned. It's an incredibly narrow distinction. It's why it was so controversial at the time. It's why it remains controversial to this day, because you're dealing with someone who would have been at the time in his teens or his early 20s, who would have been under enormous pressure. And as my understanding of the case was, that he fired shots as the car approached, which wouldn't have been subject to action, and then a nanosecond later fired a shot through the rear of it, the windscreen, which sadly killed somebody, and that was the point upon which the case turned. Now, I know that those who have served may well say, well, the rules are what they are, and you have to accept, you have to work within the rules, and I, of course, entirely hear that. But it's the point that my honourable friend for Wells makes, which is that if it's difficult at that time to make that incredibly narrow distinction, when you are frightened, when you are under enormous pressure, when you are young and you are inexperienced, how much more difficult is it to try to remember those issues and how you felt and the reason why you acted as you did 50 years later? Exactly. Everyone should be absolutely clear. I am not saying, and nobody in this House is saying, that servicemen should be above the law. But we should be absolutely clear, firstly, that there is no moral equivalence whatsoever between servicemen who are sent to do a job, who go out to protect people, who go out to do their duty, and who are involved in an incident that is unplanned. There is no moral equivalence whatsoever between those people and terrorists who set out to do none of those things, but who set out to maim and murder. And so no one is suggesting that servicemen should be above the law. What they are after is not a carte blanche for them to do whatever they like, but a recognition of those incredibly difficult and trying circumstances when they are young, inexperienced, frightened, and under severe pressure at a split second. Yes.
For giving way. He's making an excellent speech and raising a number of notable points in his speech. I must declare an interest that my husband is a veteran, but the point that I wanted to make is that in those circumstances as well, having worked as a psychologist and particularly with trauma, we know that trauma affects the brain after incidents occur too, and it might be extremely unlikely in many of these circumstances that people will have an accurate recollection through trauma processing for these incidents that have happened, and surely that must also be taken into account in the cases that are mentioned.
That's an outstanding point, and I entirely agree. My honourable friend for Wells made a similar point. I haven't prosecuted or defended in a case like this, no military case, but I have a phrase, an assault, and as any criminal barrister will tell you, that if there are 10 witnesses to an affray, you have 10 different versions of events, and there's a number of reasons for that. It's partly perception, but it's also the fact that everybody's involved in a situation which is stressful, and that has an effect upon the brain. And of course, that is exacerbated over the course of months and years as time passes. So I think probably we would accept that it may be that there has to be an investigation. But it is, as my honourable friend, I'm glad he's just come back in for Chingford, made the point about natural justice, I think, that there does come a point when someone has been investigated by a proper competent authority, when they have been acquitted, and that is the point at which they should not be seeing repeated historic investigations over matters where they have been investigated and they have been acquitted. It's getting close to the double jeopardy rule, which always used to exist, except in certain circumstances. I do not accept that there is not a way for the law to deal with this. The very fact of the matter that, and I'm grateful for the Secretary of State's indication that a statute of limitations or a presumption not to prosecute, much amounts to the same thing, is going to be considered for those who served outside of the UK. But I can see it would be incredibly difficult to have two regimes for a soldier who, in some circumstances, served in Iraq or Afghanistan, but also happened to serve in Northern Ireland, and yet a different regime applies to that self-same individual. It's very difficult for me to see how that can be a logically sustainable justice situation for the law of the land were that to happen. The point essentially is this. Those who have put everything on the line for us are entitled at the very least for us to draw a line after which they know that they don't have to fear a knock on the door in the night, where they don't have to fear a cavalcade of police cars, as we have heard, taking them all the way when they are in their old age. I'm very grateful for the fact that the Secretary of State has given the indication that she has, but there are ways in which this matter can be dealt with. A statute of limitations would, for example, have the exceptional circumstances safeguard of which we've spoken for when there would be new evidence that has come up, as would be the same for a presumption not to prosecute. And we, as I observed in the last time we had this debate, we have a similar thing in civil law. Obviously, it's not the same, but there is a safeguard for when matters come to light years later in that case. If, for example, a witness appeared who simply had never been seen before, to say, give one example off the top of my head. So the law is able to do this. What we need is the political will. This matter has been going on for far too long. Those who served in Northern Ireland are entitled to know that their country has got their back in the same way as they had their country's back at the time of maximum peril. We've had enough talk. We need to have some action, and we need to have it now.
Mr Bone, this obviously has been an extremely emotional debate, and many honourable and gallant members have spoken passionately about their own personal experience in Northern Ireland. Of course, we do expect the highest standards from our armed forces, and that requires them to operate within the rule of law in accordance with the rules of engagement. We do know that military operations in Northern Ireland were highly stressful, so the level of training was central to ensuring that discipline was maintained. And many members have already spoken this afternoon about the restraint that they had to exercise in the course of their service in Northern Ireland. And indeed, they have described their exemplary behaviour. But we also know that the actions of a few individuals of the armed forces during Operation Banner, which in the case of the Bloody Sunday killings, Prime Minister David Cameron described as unjustified and unjustifiable, let down their colleagues and made the overall task more difficult. We've also heard many examples of how stressful the process has been for the individuals and families involved. And the member for Belfast East and also Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport asked questions about what sort of new evidence would be considered appropriate when looking at these investigations. So I think that's an important question that we need to have answered. Many of these families have been left in limbo whilst investigations drag on, as have members or former members of the armed forces. The Legacy Investigation Branch of the PSNI is currently reviewing all deaths attributed to security situation in Northern Ireland between 1968 and the Belfast Agreement in 1998. However, it is not only deaths attributed to security personnel that are being investigated. So we need to be careful when we have talk of soldiers being prosecuted or being easy targets for prosecution and terrorists getting away scot-free, because that's simply not true. Any decision by the Legacy Investigation Branch to prosecute is referred to the Director of Public Prosecutions for Northern Ireland. That is an independent process without UK government involvement. As I said, we have to be careful about the language we use. In March, the Northern Ireland Secretary was forced to issue an apology to the House
for what she described as her deeply insensitive comments on state killings in Northern Ireland. She referred to her inaccurate comments on the actions of soldiers during the Troubles. And in her statement to the House, she declared, "What I said was wrong. It was deeply insensitive to the families who lost loved ones in incidents involving the security forces." And she added that any evidence of wrongdoing should be pursued without fear or favour, whoever the perpetrators might be. And this is crucial to the ongoing peace process. Because if we lose sight of what we have achieved in Northern Ireland and what we continue to want to achieve in Northern Ireland, we must be sensitive to the victims on both sides. We also have to have confidence. No, I'm not going to give way. We also must have confidence in the institutions of the police and judiciary in Northern Ireland to serve the people. I've already said I won't give way. It's for...
The Honourable Lady has every right not to give way, as the member knows, and she's indicated she doesn't want to give way. Carol Monaghan.
It's for Stormont to reform. We must have confidence in the institutions of the police and judiciary in Northern Ireland, and it's for Stormont to reform them if they are not serving them well. And I certainly hope, and I would hope that honourable members in this place today join me in my hopes that we can see Stormont functioning again fully in the future. That said, none of us wants former, or for that matter, current members of the armed forces to be treated unfairly when accusations of wrongdoing are made. I would hope that we all support the idea of justice being done, and that does include fairness to our armed forces personnel, who are entitled to due process in answering allegations made. Our armed forces have our gratitude for defending us and our values in traumatic and highly stressful situations. Prime Minister David Cameron made a statement to the House on the 15th of June, the day the Savo report was published. He said, "The conclusions of this report are absolutely clear. There is no doubt, there is nothing equivocal, there are no ambiguities. What happened on Bloody Sunday was both unjustified and unjustifiable. It was wrong." Now, the member for Beckenham talked about the yellow card, and he has his yellow card here, and he talked about the rules of engagement that had to be adhered to during any conflict. However, the statement from Prime Minister Cameron went on to say, "None of the casualties shot by soldiers of support company was armed with a firearm." And he finds that in no case was any warning given by soldiers before opening fire.
I remember give way.
No, it wouldn't.
Provost didn't give many warnings.
I sincerely hope the honourable member is not comparing our members of our armed forces to terrorists.
No, he's not. No, I'm not. No, he's not.
These investigations must not be time-constrained. The idea that after a set period of time, a line is drawn under past incidents does not support the family's need for resolution. And the chair of the Defence Select Committee made some interesting points when he referred to his report, and he talked about a truth recovery mechanism. Now, a truth recovery mechanism will still need investigation of incidents. Yeah. So regardless of what we are doing, there has to be some sort of closure for families and for victims.
Would she accept, though, that the truth recovery mechanism has the great advantage that by removing the threat of prosecution, it makes it much more likely that the truth will come out and families will find resolution?
And I think he does make a very good point, and I think that's an important point to make, because I don't think any of us here want to see 70-year-old soldiers or former soldiers going to jail. Don't think any of us want to see that. However, in order to get to the truth, there has to be investigation. But he also has to acknowledge that part of this is tied up within the Belfast Agreement. So we can't start making changes without having an impact on the Belfast Agreement. In 2012, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary inspected the role and function of the Historical Inquiries team, and the subsequent report was highly critical of the Historical Inquiries team. And in 2013, the PSNI announced it would review all military cases relating to the period 1968 up until the Good Friday Agreement was signed, in order to ensure the quality of the review reached the required standard. Surely, when we know that original investigations have been flawed, that haven't included full written witness statements, haven't taken account of all the ballistic evidence, surely when we know this, we cannot object to attempts to reach the truth. This Parliament has a responsibility to support the peace process. None of us want a return to the violence of the past. Reconciliation and trust are key elements of this process. But if this place introduced legislation which prevented still grieving families from learning the full truth about those who killed their loved ones, this fragile process is put at risk.
Minister. Thank you very much. Mr Bowen, it's a pleasure to serve under you, and can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Stockport for bringing this. Can I say it's a Southport. It's a common truism and a common error for people to say that this has been one of the most important debates that they've heard and to actually pay credit to it. I think on this occasion that is not an exaggeration. I think on this occasion I've been privileged, as have many of us, to hear some extraordinary testimony, not just from eyewitnesses, but from people who have made it part of their business to actually study this awful, tragic business over many, many years. And I think that on the one hand, we have the ugly, unfortunate, unacceptable image of pensioners being dragged from the golf course, but on the other hand, we also have to look into the eyes of those whose relatives were killed. And I'm glad that some people actually mentioned the victims. I think it is important to mention the victims. We have to, Mr Bowen, ask ourselves, are we seriously saying that at no stage, at any time in the 30 years of Operation Banner, no person in British Army uniform committed murder? I think that we all know that there were incidences. Don't forget, there were 4 soldiers were convicted of murder during that period. One, the case was in fact then downgraded to manslaughter. All 4 of them were sentenced to life imprisonment. All 4 of them were then released by the royal prerogative after less than 5 years, and all 4 of them rejoined the British Army. I don't say that I've met any single person serving or former serving within the armed forces who has nothing but contempt for those soldiers who break their oath, who actually act outside the area of which they should. And I think that that is incredibly important. What we have to do is to recognise that there are 2 sides, and obviously we have the sympathy for people. But the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Witney, I think in many ways actually encapsulated the heart of the problem here. He implied, and I don't know if he implied or whether he actually meant to do more than that, that we should have prosecuted at the time. That in many ways the problem here is justice delayed. And that the problem is, had these cases not been prosecuted at the time, then we are led into the situation we have at the present. And might that not have been a more sensible case? But the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Southport, and it bears repetition, talked about over 3,000 people who died during the Troubles. Mr Bowen, it's another, probably the most chilling statistic I've ever heard in my life, is that twice that number, more than that number, have killed themselves since the Good Friday Agreement. Over 3,000 suicides in Northern Ireland. That tells you something about the continuation of the horror that has bitten deep into the soul. And I think when we heard the testimony of the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Strangford, and I call him my friend, if I may, the Honourable Gentleman, my friend, the member for Strangford, we realise how raw these emotions still are, which is why we have to, if at all humanly possible, be as dispassionate as we can. That's not easy. Not easy at all. But I think we have to realise that we're talking about points of law here. We're also talking about decisions that we take in this House that can echo down the ages. It will echo for years to come. We have to be very, very cautious and careful in what we say. And I think my honourable friend, the member for Plymouth Devonport, quite lightly referred to the chain of command. This is something that's not been discussed over much. I think in some cases, ordinary troops, ordinary soldiers, ordinary sailors, ordinary airmen and women were let down by the chain of command. And I think there was an issue here, which brings us on to the extraordinary speech from the honourable and gallant gentleman, the member for Beckenham. I was privileged to be in the House to hear that incredible occasion when he quoted Kipling, Tommy this and Tommy that, and chuck him out the brute, but it's saviour of the country when the guns begin to shoot. And I never saw active service, but I felt in the emotions that the honourable gentleman, the honourable and gallant gentleman, showed on that occasion and on this, the real importance of this. But he talked about the yellow card. I have to say, Mr. Bone, I think there's been much discussion about this, but I think we need to have a few facts about the yellow card. It was actually amended 6 times between 1969 and 1972, and it was never, ever intended to supersede common law. There is in common law the right of self-defence. Nobody ever suggested that the yellow card was anything other than a source of guidance. It was not superseding common law. Common law still, and this brings us back to the centrality of what we're talking about here. Yeah, just as soon as I finish the sentence, it brings us back to the centrality of what we're talking about here, is that the law has to apply to all on every occasion. I happily give way to the former distinct Defence Minister.
I'm grateful for that, very kind. Could he remind us, what colour was the card that the IRA had to abide by before opening fire on civilians or servicemen?
Mr. Bowen, if there's one thing that I think has echoed round this hall today, is the fact that there is no equivalence. No equivalence between terrorists and troops. No equivalence between people who wear uniform and people who wear balaclavas. I'm sorry, I resent that point, and I think to try to make that point actually demeans the quality of some of the debate. I know the right honourable gentleman was a very distinguished Defence Minister, and I know he speaks with good sense on many occasions, but that, I think, was slightly unworthy of him. However, if I can just continue, the honourable gentleman for East Belfast quite rightly talked about the rule of law, and he talked about something which I still find almost too agonising to think about, these business about the on-the-run letters. I can do no better than quote the words of Mark Durkan, formerly of this parish, who actually said that he felt that those letters, and I quote, blighted the peace process with their penchant for side deals, pseudo-deals, shabby deals, and secret deals. On this side of the House, and I think hopefully on all sides of the House, I think we recognise that that is the case. They're not defensible, and we wouldn't seek to defend them today. The honourable gentleman for New Forest East raised an extremely interesting point, and I think a few other people referred to this. That is the almost unbearable tension that exists in the mind of a 17, 18, 19-year-old person. The tension that exists when you know at any minute something you do could have lethal consequences. Lethal consequences against you or from you. And I think that is the point. It is just as terrifying to think of the damage you could do to someone as it is to think of the damage that they could do for you. And I think that the point he makes about that fear is one that only people really who've actually been in that situation can understand, which is why I'm grateful to actually have heard that. And I think the honourable gentleman for Strangford actually talked about the environment of tension, and I think that's something we do need to actually talk about. The honourable gentleman, the member for Plymouth Moorview, widened the horizons of this debate and talked about IHAT and about lawfare. I have no case to make for lawfare or those ambulance-chasing scoundrels of lawyers who somehow managed to infest the lower reaches of the legal system like foul leeches trying to take blood from our people. I have no time for those people who came up with trumped-up cases and to embarrass, and in many cases to threaten and to terrify people who'd served with distinction and with honour. I've got no time for those leeches, those bloodsuckers, those ambulance-chasing scumbags. I've got another half dozen insults to go yet, but can I say, I appreciate that the honourable and learned gentleman has in fact confessed in public today to being a lawyer. So if he would like to redress the balance, I'll happily give way to him.
I'm very grateful. I was enjoying listening to the stream of insults there. I feel I ought to perhaps reiterate the point that I made earlier in sticking up for my profession, which is that lawyers just interpret the law as it stands. It's for ministers to act and Parliament to make the law. If there's a problem, as I think many of us will accept there is, it's for us to deal with it, not to blame the lawyers.
I can just say, Mr. Bone, fabrication of evidence is not a legal requirement of the British Parliament. we have not stated at any stage that, subsection 27b, part 3 of Schedule 2 says, and thou shalt go forth and fabricate evidence. So I think that there were more than enough cases where people actually went way, way beyond the high standards of the legal profession, so gloriously and elegantly exemplified by the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Witney. I have to say that I've heard many speeches from the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, and I've never regretted a second that I spent listening to them, because he speaks with profound good sense. Today he gave us a slightly unusual perspective of the man in the caravan in the Masonic Hall car park. But again, he made the point about the tension and the impact and the effect on young people. And Mr. Byrne, I think this is incredibly important. You often get, within groups of young people in that situation, one person who tends to lead within that group. And if there's one person in his platoon who actually has a contemptuous and contemptible attitude towards the people they're supposed to be protecting, quite often you'll find that ratchets up. And quite often you will actually find a person saying things which are unforgivable, and other people within that platoon, within that file, on that mess deck, will be uncomfortable about actually challenging it. And I think you get this with human behaviour. It's human. And I think it's important that he actually realise that. I also think, Mr. Bone, we can't mention the name of the late Captain Robert Nairac too often. We're at the anniversary of his disappearance and his death. And I think that what a tragic waste of a life that was. One of 3,500 by all means. But a man who gave his all, everything for his country. And I don't think that we can forget him. The Honourable Member for South Dorset actually talked about, and I found this extraordinarily moving, he talked about as a newly commissioned officer arriving in civvies on a civilian transport into Northern Ireland and finding himself in a country he didn't recognise, in a place he didn't recognise. And isn't, Mr. Bone, that some of the problem? That in the relationship of us towards John Bull's other island, that very often we don't understand Ireland and we don't understand the Irish. And I think it would have been even more honest of him to actually say that he had maybe some preconceptions about Ireland. But the fact that he had the courage to say today that when he arrived there, he didn't actually realise the full nature of the place he was coming to. And I think that shock was quite dramatic. I think it's very much to his credit that he... Yes, very quickly.
Very quick. I'm most grateful to Shadow. Shadow Minister's covering all the speeches with great eloquence. Could you just give us a flavour of where Labour stands on this very, very, as he's clearly indicating, emotive issue?
Yes, indeed. You'll be delighted to know, Mr. Bone, that our Shadow Secretary of State for Defence have actually is issued a statement via something called Twitter, which provides the whole thing. And rather than take up the time of this committee, as time is short, I will send him across a copy of it, which enunciates precisely what we're doing. However, if I could just finish, the Honourable Member for Wells talked about Kabul, and he talked about in a wider situation. But what it comes down to, Mr. Bone, and I finish on this point, is I'm not precisely sure what it is the petitioners are asking for. They're not asking for an amnesty. They're not asking for a statute of limitations because, frankly, justice cannot be time expired. You cannot have a situation where a crime is a crime one day and then a few years later it isn't a crime. You can't do that. So I'd like to know what it is exactly they do want. And I think if there's one thing, Mr. Bone, that everybody in the hall here today agrees on, is that this matter has been dealt with without sensitivity, without subtlety and without good sense. The idea of a cavalcade of police rocking up at somebody's house at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning is indefensible. We cannot go there. So what I would say is that we need to be much, much more sensitive. And if we cannot turn the clock back and we cannot investigate these cases then, and we're going to investigate them now, we need to be sensible. And we need, above all, to remember those two groups. The veterans, by all means. But also, let us never, ever forget the victims. Thank you.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Bone. And good to have you looking after the second half of our proceedings today. And can I just start by echoing the repeated compliments and tributes to my honourable friend from Southport, who has led this debate and kicked off a tremendously important, and I think by turns angry, passionate, emotional set of contributions from a series of colleagues, many of whom have served personally in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, and even those who haven't done so, including, indeed, people who have confessed to being lawyers during the course of the afternoon. everyone has been incredibly, I think, understanding and sympathetic to the plight which we are all discussing here today. My honourable friend from Southport started rightly, I think, by saying that the vast majority of the deaths caused during the Troubles were caused by terrorists. A very small minority can be attributed to the actions of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. And I should just pause and say, it isn't just, if you listen to veterans, it isn't just a question of prosecutions. Those are difficult enough and they need a lot of support. It is also a question of the repeated and unending investigations before any prosecution ever happens. And in fact, in many cases, no prosecution has ever happened in most cases, but people are living in fear of the knock at the door, the cavalcade of police cars turning up at 5 a.m, the repeated interviews, often, as my honourable friend for Wells eloquently put it, of events that happened not just 30, 40, 50 years ago, but happened in the fog of war and were hard to remember and define and record clearly a few days later, let alone decades further on. So then we had, Mr. Bone, a catalogue of worries, of concerns, of justified, I think, outrage. Comments like betrayal, injustice, and lawfare. In fact, I thought one of the most telling contributions was made by my honourable friend from Newbury, who intervened early on and made the point, which I think was widely accepted, and he's a former Green Jacket himself, that soldiers went out to protect innocent civilians, whereas terrorists went out specifically to kill and maim. And his point was that there should be no moral equivalence between those two purposes. This is a point which has been made many, many times by other people during the course of this afternoon's discussions. We've then ended up, Mr. Bone, with, I think, one of the most powerful speeches I've heard in a long time from the honourable and gallant member for Beckenham, equipped with his yellow card, which he'd kept all that time from his tours in Northern Ireland, and he made the point about decisions made in milliseconds, which then get re-examined at leisure in peaceful courtrooms many years later. That is extremely hard to justify as an approach to justice. And he also made, I think eloquently, a point which others made as well. He said, we acted within the law, but if we didn't, we should be prosecuted. And that is a point which has been made repeatedly by other people here as well. In fact, it was made by the honourable gentleman from Southport when he kicked this thing off. He said that the rule of law must be applied, but for service people, breaches of those laws were a very rare exception. They were not the norm. But nobody here is trying to pretend, I don't think I've heard a single person say, that those breaches of the law shouldn't be treated with utmost care and gravity and severity. But nor should we pretend that they were common or ubiquitous or frequent either. And it is essential when we try to maintain a sense of proportion, a sense of balance here, which many people have rightly, I think, pointed out, is widely felt not to have been achieved, that we don't forget that central fact. The honourable gentleman from East Belfast made the absolutely correct point. Sacrifice doesn't come in different grades, he said. And he said also that any solution must work under Article 2 of the Human Rights Act, and he's absolutely right about that. He also made a crucial distinction between an amnesty and a statute of limitations, a point which was echoed later on. And he rightly said that we need to do more before, one of the more affecting points, I thought, read out a very sombre and sober lists of names of some of the people killed just in the few weeks before the Bloody Sunday outrages. The Select Committee Chair, my honourable friend from New Forest East, was, I thought, extremely careful in his views because he said, look, we need to make progress. In fact, we are making some progress, but he rightly said, but we have not made enough progress, not nearly enough progress. And he then mentioned the Nelson Mandela approach. And if I will, I wish to come back to that point because I think that that is central to any potential action and solution that we may want to come to later. And I will try and make sure, Mr. Bone, that not only do I leave a few moments for my honourable friend from Southport to respond, but also to suggest at the end of this some actions that can be taken. Because rightly, people have said repeatedly that words are all very well. Politicians, all of us here, are good at words. I'm afraid this is a Westminster Hall debate which doesn't result in legislation per se. So we can't debate a law here this afternoon, but we can at least start to move towards actions, and I hope to be able to propose some of those happily, but briefly if I can.
Could my honourable friend brief us and tell us why the Prime Minister excluded Northern Ireland veterans from the 10-year exclusion policy that, as I believe, it is hopefully going to go forward?
Mr. Byrne, this is something which was discussed at some length in the urgent question last Thursday as well. And there's an important point which a number of people have made during the course of this afternoon's debate, and also was made on Thursday, which is that for people serving on Operation Banner, it didn't feel any different. It felt the same, whether if you were patrolling in Northern Ireland or if you were patrolling in Basra or in Afghanistan, doesn't matter where. The surroundings may have been different, but it felt the same, and you felt under the same pressures, and you expected, and I think morally everyone here has made the point rightly, that we owe, as a society, the same debt of gratitude, and not just a debt of gratitude, but also, as I think my honourable friend from Wells rightly pointed out, I think he said, and I'm probably going to misquote him here, that no matter what happens, come what may, we've got your back. And so no matter where you've served, that should be the outcome. The difficulty, to answer his point, is that in strict legal terms, the legal basis under which the service took place, abroad or in the UK, is different. Our challenge as lawmakers is to make sure that the outcome for our servicemen and women is the same. They may have to start from different places, but the destination has to be the same. And if we cannot do that, Mr. Bone, then we will have failed, and failed really badly. My honourable friend, very briefly, I'm just conscious of making sure I've got enough time to...
Very grateful to the Minister because he conceptualised well the challenge. Is he up for it?
Mr. Bone, I certainly am, and I hope to come on to at least some initial comments about the actions that we might be able to take as a Parliament and as a government going forward, and as a society going forward. I will very briefly, and then I must make progress, otherwise...
Simply to say, I'm sure we're all concerned to get to root causes, and so I just very much hope he'll get to the Stormont House Agreement.
That is indeed one of the points I'm going to make when we come to the actions as well. Can I just briefly mention, though, the Honourable Gentleman from Strangford, who made one of the most emotional contributions. He served, I think, in Northern Ireland himself, and his enjoinder that we must all be honourable and do right by our veterans, and he is absolutely right. And then I thought one of the most thoughtful examples of controlled anger of the afternoon, which came from my honourable friend and gallant friend from Plymouth Moor View, who said, we have to do more. I think everybody here would agree with that. He also said, we're not asking, he said, for an amnesty for war crimes. He said a statute of limitations, pure and simple, can't work because there should never be a time limit on serious criminal behaviour, although he was then interested and saying something around the announced presumption of non-prosecutions looks promising, he was pointing out. But he also, and I think this is a point which everybody here would echo as well, he was also rightly contemptuous of the false narrative of hope which the legal teams of the lawfare profession are using to manipulate victims' grief. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I won't go through everybody, but I just wanted to say, my right honourable friend, member for Chingford and Woodford, said quite rightly, and this is the point I was just making, that UK law can't be used, the fact that it's UK law rather than service abroad, cannot be used as an excuse for failing to help Northern Ireland service versus service abroad. This cannot stand, and it is a deep injustice. I will gloss over, just because of pressure of time, Mr. Bone, some of the other comments, but they were all valid. My honourable friend from Dorset South, himself a former Grenadier Guard, made the point that our words must match our action. He's absolutely right. My honourable friend from Wells, a former rifleman, said, how can legal cases be tried justly decades later after the fog of war has passed? And my right honourable friend, the member for Shropshire North, a former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland himself, so a man who has personal experience of many of these policy issues as well, said, and I think again this is a point which would be widely echoed right the way around this chamber, that no further legal process should happen unless there is clear and categoric new evidence. A point I think made as well by my honourable friend from Witney, who said that we need to not go anywhere near what used to be called the double jeopardy rule, where you can't be tried twice for the same effect. So, Mr. Chairman, what must we achieve? Well, we must achieve an answer which will do several things. It must work for veterans in the armed forces. Yes, of course it must. But it must also work for former police officers and prison guards and wardens too. They are not armed forces. They have a different legal basis, but it must work for them as well. It must work for innocent, peaceful Catholics and Protestants alike in Northern Ireland as well. People who have never served, never wanted to serve, but were potentially in the line of fire from some of the actions that took place. It must work for the victims and the families of the victims, and we've heard some of that, but it needs to be emphasised, and it must also, most importantly, it must work in court so that when inevitably the legal challenges come from the lawfare brigade, this thing stands up and is robust, because if it does not, then we will, Mr. Bone, have failed in our duty to protect our former service men and women. It is no point coming up with something which sounds great and then falls over the first time a clever lawyer pokes it in court. That will not stand. And finally, Mr. Bone, and I've treble underlined this in my notes, it must draw a line. It must draw a line and allow people to move on. Not just the victims, not just the veterans. It must allow the whole society in Northern Ireland to draw a line. And that is why I come back to the point made by the chairman of the Select Committee. It is not an exact comparison between Northern Ireland, which is a unique place, and South Africa, but there are many parallels, saying we have to find some way of creating an approach which will allow people to get closure and truth and justice. And therefore, what I hope we will do, and what I expect us to do, is firstly, soon, very soon, Mr. Bone, publish the results of the consultation so we can all see what people in Northern Ireland genuinely think about the details of the questions, and then, again, promptly after that, announce the government response, which needs to be actions, not words. The Stormont proposals are a starting point, but there are genuine concerns on all sides about the details of those proposals. They cannot stand as they are, but they are a good starting point, and we need to work on the details about how we modify those so that we can then bring forward a bill. And the crucial thing, Mr. Bone, is the point made in the end by my right honourable friend for Chingford and Woodford. When natural justice collides with the law must change, and that is what we do here.
Damien Moore, to wind up.
Thank you, Mr. Bone. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the conclusion of this debate today. I would like to thank all honourable, right honourable and gallant friends and members for their contributions, particularly the gallant member for Beckenham and the honourable member for Strangford. We have a moral obligation to ensure that justice is done. It doesn't mean special treatment for veterans, but what it does mean is that if we are to have, for example, a statute of limitations, that they are not excluded from it, because they do deserve fairness, justice and closure on this issue.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 243947 relating to immunity for soldiers. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Thank you.